are many variables that would affect the plants that you can grow in your gardens: light, aspect, moisture levels, soil type, and pH. Today I'm going to look at pH and put together some combinations of plants so that you know what to do when you discover your soil type and what this means for you when you're buying plants for your garden. So, as gardeners, you probably all know about the pH scale. The pH stands for potential for power of hydrogen. Hydrogen is important because high or low quantities of this make the uptake of certain nutrients difficult for most plants, which is why the mid-range of 6.5 to 7 is where most plants like to be. But there are particular plants that thrive in acid or alkali soils. You can use a home testing kit, which is very reliable, to find out your soil pH, and the instructions, and you will know within minutes where you are on the scale. And then the planting fun begins.
Hunera Ikram in 2020 talking about the importance of knowing where your soil sits on the pH scale. For all those pH specific plant suggestions from Hunera, listen back to the show called GQ2 at Home, episode 15. You'll find simple do-it-yourself testing kits at your local garden centre or online. They don't cost too much. A quick dip with a strip and you'll soon be on the road producing healthy, vibrant plants. The next step on our journey to the world of groundwork is to discover our soil type. On the whole, there are 6 basic constitutions: sand, silt, peat, chalk, loam, and clay. Each type is characterised by its level of drainage and fertility. The right time to evaluate these factors is when you move into a new property. This question was put to the panel at the University of Reading in 2015.
Hi, it's Susan Taylor-Country here from Berkeley in Gloucestershire. We have just purchased our first home and inherited a garden with not much in it. I wondered if you had any advice for a brand new gardener wanting to add some interest and a bit of excitement to the garden. So your home is great. We have a north-facing garden with reasonable drainage and sandy soil.
Okay, so first things first, I suppose. What do you need to start off? What comes from the design as well in this situation?
You need to get an accurate survey. When you do it yourself, or you download one from the internet and enlarge it, so you've got an actual survey. Because often you look, I go into someone's garden and it looks square, and then you look at the survey, and that makes such a difference because your eye continually deceives you. If you're going to be there for 50 years, then if you get the bones right at the beginning, it gets so much better. Great tips there from Bob Flaherty and Bunny Guinness on getting the bones right in the beginning by getting or downloading a survey of your garden before you start and observing to see what plants might emerge. It might take a bit of willpower though to sit back and just watch for a year. Peter Gibbs was chairing. There is one soil type that sends more questions our way than any other: clay. This one comes from a 2019 show in Culm in Wiltshire.
I'm Eddie Wilson from Culm. How can I create a workable soil in the garden I want? It's compact, heavy clay, rubble and soft.
One of the things to bear in mind is that if the ground is a natural clay soil, then compaction is going to be a problem. If there's no debris in the ground, then that clay soil can be re-enlivened. So you can fork very deeply, you can use deep rooted penetrating plants, which will help to bring some life back into the soil. But I think by and large the thing to do is actually bring the soil up. So build raised beds, whether that's with timber surrounds or whether that's with something slightly more permanent, and bring new soil in. All of the life in our soil exists in the top 60 to 70 centimetres, and that's if you've got deep topsoil. If you've only got 30 centimetres, that's where the life is. So that's what we need to bring back into the garden. Think of your existing plot as a foundation and then build up from that. Lots of work often about matter. Soil from good source, whether it's a local farm or whether it's to a British standard specification, which has been treated, will be weed free and is a more friable medium with a certain quantity of organic matter, so you know exactly what it is you're getting. And make sure that you keep adding organic matter year on year. And eventually that subsoil will relinquish its grip on that
workshop with our questionnaire with their clay soil and recommending, as we often do, a boost of organic matter. Which brings us to our third step, soil improvement. Once we've discovered what soil we're working with, we may want to take steps to try to improve its quality. There are a number of different techniques and materials we can use to change the way our soil looks, feels and behaves. Here's a clip from the 1960s when gardeners were swinging their spades into the ground with some vigour.
Now your name and question, please, sir.
My name is Joe Cullen, and I wish to know, would you advise digging the garden in the autumn and burying the farmyard manure?
Well, it's a very straightforward question, and I'm going to put to Fred loads. Mr. Cullen's asking you, Fred, if you'd advise autumn digging and burying farmyard manure at the same time. I don't know what your soil is, by the way. You've got clay. Well, with that evidence, what about Fred?
That makes a lot of difference, because if it was sand, I would say leave it. But with heavy clay, I would like to get all my digging done before Christmas and laid up as rough as possible. And where it hasn't been turned over for a long time, new gardens, I would prefer to rid it. Now, incorporating straw manure in at the same time is all right, but if you can't get manure at that time, don't worry. Compost it and put it on the surface in the springtime and rake your stuff down over the top of it.
I think I would agree with that, except that I wouldn't, on this clay soil, I wouldn't put the manure in winter at all. I think it would be better in a stack composting. Turn your soil over and leave it rot, as Fred said, rigid if you can, which means exposing a larger surface to the elements of the soil, the frost, which you won't get here, I suppose. You won't get much frost. But the weather will do something, the wind and the rain and whatnot will do something to break it down, the birds and whatnot. And put the muck in spring.
Can I say that you don't need to do either one, you can do both. You put some of it in the autumn, which is a perfectly good thing in a clay soil to help lighten it over the winter, and you can save some back to compost that you can then surface stress with in the spring. I prefer, honestly, to split the difference between my two colleagues. I often act in this way. I'm a kind of buffer between an irresistible force and a movable object.
But it can be interpreted as indecision.
That is not. This is only indecision if you haven't a reason for it. I have perfectly good reason, which I'm trying to advance.
That's why you've lost your hair.
That's why I lost my hair, yet worrying about what these people said.
Acting as a buffer.
For the same reason he votes Liberal.
You're in Wales, what better could I vote?
Does that clear it all up, Mr. Cullen? Thank you.
Nurseryman Alan Gemmell, lecturer and horticulturist Bill Sowerbutts, and head gardener Fred Lowe's, with some unusually balanced views and a bit of political satire thrown in for good measure, plus the wonderfully rich voice of Chair Franklin Engelman. That programme was recorded in Penarth in Wales in November 1965, a time when manure was readily available and would be dug in at regular intervals. This method, like so many in gardening, was inherited from the Victorians, and had a heck of a lot of horse manure to get rid of, particularly in their kitchen gardens. But times have changed, and the no-dig method is gaining more and more traction. Leaving the soil well alone to do its own thing is believed to be a more favourable approach to flora and soil fauna. Last year, Anne Swithenbank met one expert who definitely prefers a light touch when it comes to his soil.
I'm visiting South Somerset, rural South Somerset. The sun is shining and I'm surrounded by productive vegetable beds. Quite now I wonder, that is approximately I'm standing here with Charles Dowding. Now, experienced gardeners, or pretty much any gardener, will immediately think no dig when they hear the name Charles Dowding. Charles, you can't be credited with inventing no dig, but you can certainly be credited with spreading the word, can't you?
Yeah, massively. It's really correct there now, all over the world. And largely thanks to social media, obviously, which has just traversed the ocean so easily.
So what is the principle of no dig? What does it actually mean?
Well, it's about not disturbing the soil where appropriate, which means you can do a bit of digging if you need to. For instance, I get asked on YouTube that, well, with no dig, how do you plant an apple tree? Yeah, okay, you can dig a hole. And so, planting that kind of thing, whatever you need to do, disturb the soil as much as you need to, or I should say as little as you need to. And then in general, you're just not disturbing anything, because the aim is to keep the life of the soil happy, undisturbed, so it can do its work and multiply without interruption. And then the other aspect of no dig is feeding that life So that's with organic matter on the surface. Basically copying nature. It's how nature works, understood, so organic matter landing on the surface. And then the variation is for vegetables, which are more demanding plants, I would say, mostly highly bred. And for those, that's where the compost comes in. So you short circuit the organic matter production, if you like, and make more. And I'm putting on about 3 centimetre of compost, new compost, once a year on all my beds, whatever they're going to go.
But when I'm starting from scratch and I've got a piece of sort of virgin clay soil in front of me, the urge to dig is so overwhelming. I start by digging and then I go no dig. So how do you get past that sort of urge to dig?
Well,
Convince
I
me.
can only speak for myself. I certainly don't have an urge to dig, but in your case, you do need a fair amount of compost if you want to plant straight away. So just to be clear on that, if you didn't want to plant straight away, say you started no dig in the autumn, you could use as little as 5 centimetre of compost on cardboard, which might be, like I've got a bit here, so I've just put some cardboard right on the weedy ground.
So you would cut it first, so it's low, and
just
then
get it
you
level,
put your
basically.
cardboard down,
Cardboard
and then
down.
on that you're just...
We cultivating part of my garden.
I see, and you're trying to skim the top and store this dirt so you can use it another year as compost. Right. Well, now, this is very good stuff to use. And can you get any other things to mix it with, like straw, shoddy, farmyard manure, anything like that?
Yes,
Well, I think if you can mix it with that, so much the better. It'll break down more quickly. What I would do is I'd get a layer of your turf, let's say about 3 or 4 inches thick, maybe even up to 6.
What's the average height?
And on the top of it, sprinkle lime. On behind
yeah?
What's
lime,
the average height for people?
and some sulfate of ammonia.
Every
Just so
chart
you can see a
height
very stubborn sulfate of ammonia on it.
for people.
Then put some of this, let's call it the long
I don't know.
material, the straw or the shoddy or the wool or anything you want to compost. And so build up a series of sandwiches of this material.
is the material which side down?
It is really a material which side downward. There'll be enough movement of bacteria, etc., within the heap that you'll build up to make that of no real account.
Well, I don't quite agree with that. Is this turf? Is it actual turf or is it weed growth? Turf. It's actually grass, it's turf. Well, it's very, very good stuff for the job. I think it should be upside down, most definitely. And I disagree with Alan in further. I think he said the lime and sulfate of ammonia on one layer. I would separate lime on one layer and the sulfate of ammonia on another layer. Separate them in distance. That's rather important.
Yes, I agree with that. I'm sorry if I gave that impression. But I don't think it makes any difference whether it's upside down or not.
I agree with the pair.
There's nothing unusual.
Now look here, let's divide this up. Now, Alan's advice and Bill's advice is perfectly all right if you're going to use that in your garden. Now, it's completely wrong if you're going to use it in the green. Because you're starting...
In pots, actually.
In part. Oh, well, we'll start again.
Well, accept Alan's advice for the garden, and that'll keep it quiet. Now, with regard
Before
to
the
second
oil
job, so
去
many people do,
買
for the
奶
greenhouse, then I prepare it neat and virgin. That is
乜
without any
乜
mixture at all.
咩叫乜？
Because if you add lime, and then you want to use it for lime haters, then, well, you just can't separate the lime from it. And adding other materials, such as compost, manure, then you have no idea how much you're going to get in a given amount. Whereas if you start off, say, with 1 bushel of virgin loam, and then adding your stuff according to the, say, John Innes recommendation,
Okay.
then you have something neat to start with.
Well,
So my advice is,
are you okay?
cut your turfs, put square, 2 to 3 inches thick.
How's the
and
test
stack
today?
them in a square heap,
Huh?
not a concrete heap, a square heap,
Huh?
turf
Yeah.
side down, your height
Huh?
about 4 feet. And
Really?
then you cut it, slice down the sides, which you can do in about 9 months. Remembering that
Huh?
your rotted roots tops will build up a toxic condition for about 6 months.
Greenhouse and garden, yes, then you'll go back both ways then.
Red loads, real sour ones up Alan Gell. Back to their usual, shall we say, constructive differences. That was 68 years ago, the summer of 1956 in Hartford in Cheshire. Rob Stead was in the chair on that occasion, with an all-in order with his humorous diplomacy. Do like laugh in GQT. Here's a question from a 2021 show during lockdown. Famously in the composting world, John Innes, mentioned in our last clip now from the 50s and often since. But who was this groundbreaking man?
This may be a silly question, but the truth is, God was John Innes. So there's been quite a program at Netflix for how to explain who Innes was.
Okay, Zara, that's absolutely not a silly question at all. Now, John Innes came from a very wealthy family, but the great thing about him was that he was philanthropic, as they often were in Victorian times. So that a lot of money, you would do something for the benefit of the greater good. My mother always used to say to me, what have you done today for the greater good? To be honest with you, the answer was generally nothing. Very late on the song, he changed his will just before he died, and they established a horticultural research institute. So the idea was that they would medically research plants for the good of feeding people, and that's what he did. And so it was this wonderful sort of approach to helping the community through gardening. And of course, John Innes, as we know through compost, fruit stocks, the research centre, Norwich as it is these days, right at the cutting edge of horticultural research. That's a really exciting place. Very positive vibes coming from it even today.
Could you quickly run us through the different types of compost that we see in our garden centres?
Well, a John Innes compost generally refers to a compost that has a soil element. So when we talk on this programme about soil-based compost, we are normally talking about John Innes type compost. And in the case of John Innes compost, there are normally 3 grades numbered 1, 2, 3, and they are used for various things, sowing and potting on and planting out. And typically the advantage that these soil-based composts can have over other composts is they tend to be slightly more stable, and they tend to hold water slightly better. But I will say another couple of things about John Innes. Some of our listeners might remember from a few years ago when we did a show at the Chelsea Fringe, and there was a fantastic duo who did a song along the lines of John Innes, why are you in my compost? I wonder if the geniuses who produce our wonderful programme can fish that one out. That'd be great fun to hear that.
Well, funny you should say that, Matthew, because we have been able to find it. The song is called John Innes. It's by Dan Woods and Joe Stevenson from their album Can You Dig It? And here's a clip of it now. John Innes, John Innes, John Innes, why is he in my compost? John Innes, John Innes, is he? John Innes, why is he in my compost? Brilliant! Absolutely wonderful.
Christmas number 1, here we come. Panellists Matthew Wilson, Matt Biggs and Pippa Greenwood enjoying that musical interlude. Now, whether it's due to poor soil conditions or limited space, some of us don't have any ground to work with. That is when we can get creative with containers. On the plus side, we're totally in charge of our growing material. The downside is something we can all relate to.
My name is Mrs. Enid from West Middlesex Society of Floral Art. What is wrong with my pot-grown hydrangea? I think I've given you a sample there.
Oh dear. Yeah, finger end sample this one. Matthew Biggs. I'll give it to you. What we've got here is 2 quite decent sized leaves. We're going a glorious set of autumnal colours down to a sort of withered brown. What do you reckon's wrong with this, Matthew?
There's 2 possible things. One is that it's been under stress. Perhaps has got severely waterlogged or even pot-bound, but also a little bit hungry. How often have you been feeding it?
No, it's been well looked after.
How often have you fed it?
It's been fed every week, really.
Because the other thing is, particularly with plants in containers, if you actually feed them regularly, you can damage the very fine feeding roots, because you get a build-up of the liquid fertiliser in the compost, and that then starts to scorch the roots by taking the moisture out from them.
So you see, this is the garden expert talking. He first of all grills you to say, hoping you're going to say, but you haven't fed it enough.
Now he's discovered you've been feeding it all right, he's got to have you for feeding it too much. But of course.
I think I did put bone meal in when I first planted it as well.
Yeah, because that's what I would say. With something like a hydrangea in a container, I would be inclined to feed it with a slow release fertilizer in the springtime, just so if you like, it's a drip feed through the year. And a lot of the slow release fertilizers respond to temperature as well as moisture, so they're only feeding the plants during the periods of growth. So I would say that it's possibly that with the regular feeding like that, it has been overfed. I can just take over the point of this overfeeding. I've been surprised over last year the number of plants I've knocked out of a pot. And by the way, never be afraid when you go into a garden centre of knocking a plant out of it. In fact, you should do. You always knock it out of its pot. First thing you should do.
Most are going to have access to public funds, so it's very unlikely they'd be receiving any amount of public funds in the way that the post suggests and describes.
Right, so an actual, to the extent that there is such a thing as an illegal immigrant, that they can claim zero in benefit.
Exactly.
So what about, for example, an asylum seeker who is waiting for their claim for asylum to be processed, so we don't actually know whether in the long run they will have the right to remain or not? What sort of benefits might they be able to have?
Yeah, so if someone's still waiting for a decision on their asylum application, then they can't access mainstream benefits. They might be placed in government-provided accommodation if they have no other means of supporting themselves, and whether those accommodations provide meals can impact the amount of money they might be eligible to receive. So if an asylum seeker is placed in accommodation which provides them with meals, then at the moment they will get £8.86 a week. That rises to £49.18 if they don't receive meals.
Which does not add up to nearly £30,000 per year. Asylum seekers do cost the state a considerable amount of money. The bill for housing asylum seekers, many of them in hotels, runs into the billions of pounds. But that is not because the asylum seekers themselves are being given wads of cash. Now, back to the dodgy WhatsApp message. What about somebody who has legally migrated to the UK? So, for example, somebody who has been granted refugee status, given the right to live and work in the UK, they presumably then could claim benefits. So what benefits might they get?
Yeah, so if someone has been granted refugee status and right to remain in the UK based on that, then the only government support specific to them is something called the Refugee Integration Loan. That's worth between £100 and £500 or £800, depending on whether you're applying for it as a single person or a couple. But as the name suggests, it is a loan, so that has to be paid back. In terms of other benefits that they might be eligible for, they can apply for the same benefits as a British citizen. So assuming that they are eligible, if they meet the criteria, then they would be able to apply for things like universal credit, which is the main types of benefits available for working age people.
These claims are basically untrue. It's just a case of exactly how true they are. I'm curious, are there any circumstances in which any kind of migrant might be able to claim £30,000 a year?
So we took a look at this. We used the example of universal credit, which I mentioned in our fact check, and there are potentially some circumstances where you might be approaching that kind of figure. Again, it's one of these things where it all depends on your circumstances, it's a whole range of different factors, and crucially in this case, it would depend on whether you are subject to the benefits you have as well. Just for some more numbers, if you were applying for universal credit, if you're a single person under the age of 25, you would get £311.68. That's the monthly standard allowance. And then that would go up to £617.60, for example, if you were applying as a couple and you're both the age of 25. So there's sort of a range there in between.
That's monthly.
That's monthly and weekly. So weekly that works out at around £72, so £150 a week. Now, as I said,
Which is still less.
Again, it's still less than the pension.
Universal credit is not a benefit, and if someone's circumstances mean that they're eligible for further benefits, they can obviously ask for it, so long as the benefits cap. The highest level of income, which is for a parent in London, is around £25,000 per year, but in certain specific circumstances, someone might be exempt from it. So, really look at it, it's potentially possible you could find someone who had a legal migrant or a British citizen of working age who would pay £20,000 in benefits, but that would be under highly limited circumstances, and that's certainly not what the WhatsApp messages claim. So if you're sent this zombie stat on WhatsApp or email or anything else, be sure to do what you can do to get it, so you don't have to come back and do this again in another 12 years. Our thanks to Airmail Group. Last week, the new Secretary of State for Energy, Ed Miliband, was very excited, and he wants to tell you all about it in this slickly produced video.
Schools back, holidays back, and I'm back announcing the record-breaking results of our renewables auction. 131 projects powering 11 million homes. This is what it means to deliver our clean energy mission.
Wow, feel the energy. I don't know about you, but I am pumped.
Okay, let's calm down and take a look at what's actually going on here. Ed Miliband was celebrating the result of the thrillingly titled Allocation Round 6 to Hereford. It's essentially an auction where energy companies bid for government-backed contracts to develop renewable energy projects such as solar farms, tidal power, and, most notably, offshore wind farms. It allows companies to work on the basis of a guaranteed price they can sell their energy, and is part of a long-standing strategy to boost the role of renewables in generating electricity. The cost, or possibly profit, of the fixed price is ultimately passed on to bill payers. Miliband called the results of the latest round record-breaking.
Yes, he did, on that video.
Now, it's true that the total number of projects that won contracts in the latest round, 131, is higher than any of the 5 previous rounds, but just looking at the number of projects doesn't really tell you anything about how much renewables generated electricity that is. One project might be a small solar farm that gives you 25 megawatts of capacity. Another might be a gigantic wind farm off the coast with thousands of turbines giving you 700 megawatts.
Right, and we don't actually care how many projects there are, we care about capacity. That's what matters.
Precisely. Now, in terms of capacity, this is not a record-breaking round. The latest auction round gave out contracts for about 9.5 gigawatts of capacity. That's higher than most rounds, but the fourth round was higher, with nearly 11 gigawatts. Now, these are contracts for future projects, which will take years to develop. We're not adding this capacity overnight, and some end up not being built. Not all of the gigawatts from the fourth auction round materialise, and that may well happen again for this one. But there's another issue with Ed Miliband's response. In other tweets, he explicitly says that Labour is responsible for the success of this latest auction. Labour came in and fixed this, he claims.
I'm all in favour of governments fixing things. Was it broken before?
Well, the last auction round under the Conservatives was not a success. The way these auctions work is that developers put in bids stating a fixed price that they're willing to accept for the electricity they generate. The people who put the lowest bids in win the contracts, because the lower the bid, the better the value for the payers of electricity bills. But in the last round, there was a fiasco over offshore wind. The wind farm developers are pleased, but because of the significant rise in costs, they would need to bid to sell the electricity they generated at higher prices than the last round. Otherwise, these projects wouldn't be financially viable. But the government said they'd only accept bids below a certain limit, a limit that industry argued was too low. If they agreed to sell electricity at that price, it wouldn't be financially viable. The government seemed to think the developers were bluffing.
Were they bluffing?
No. No one bid for any of the offshore wind contracts. And offshore wind matters. It's the biggest chunk of our renewable energy strategy. Other types of projects like solar saw contracts awarded, but absolutely no offshore wind contracts meant the auction round was pretty much a failure.
Okay, so Ed Miliband has tweeted that Labour came in and fixed this. people might assume then that Labour have fixed what was wrong with the previous auction. Is that fair?
Not really, no. The Conservative government set the rules for this latest auction, having learned from their mistakes. They decided to consider bids to sell electricity generated by offshore wind at substantially higher levels. This meant the Conservatives had already sorted out the big existential problem for the auction. That wasn't Labour. However, Labour did significantly increase the overall budget for the project, meaning that the overall production capacity that this auction has secured is about 50% higher than it would have been otherwise.
Right. So the system was already fixed, but the new government has agreed bigger contracts to secure more capacity.
Correct.
So how does that leave us in terms of our renewable energy targets?
Well, we're flying blind slightly because we're waiting for the government to fully explain their plan. But it looks like they're going to need even bigger auctions in the near future to hit their promise of creating a zero carbon electricity system by 2030. We've been talking to Johnny Gowdy, a director at renewable energy consultancy Regen.
If we take offshore wind, for example, we do know that we will need a lot more capacity. Probably we're looking at somewhere in the range of 35 to 45 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So let's take the middle of that, 40 gigawatts by 2030 as an ambitious target.
Johnny says there are roughly 15 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity now, with another 15 in various stages of construction, planning or under contract, including the stuff that we need for the latest auction.
So we need another 10 gigawatts essentially. We're going to make 40 gigawatts by 2030.
As there was about 4 gigawatts of offshore wind in the last auction, to get 10 more in time for them to be operating by 2030 is going to take some doing. That really would be record breaking.
Indeed. Charlotte McDonald, thank you very much. We on More or Less are not provocateurs. While darker corners of the information ecosystem shamelessly goad their audiences with outrage-inducing clickbait, we neatly try to add to the sum of human knowledge. But sometimes we accidentally touch on hot-button issues that fire up our listeners. No, not immigration or the culture wars. What sets our inbox alight is discussion of the fundamental logic of mathematics. So it was that last week, after we discussed the impossibility of dividing by zero with mathematician Dr. Katie Steckles, our inbox was filled with email, faster than you can say Dunning-Kruger effect. These correspondents were quick to explain that 1 divided by 0 was simply infinity. I'm sure you're getting lots of emails from mathematicians and others about this. It doesn't really need a mathematician to know that 1 divided by 0 is infinity.
The answer I was given at school was that it is infinity. Yet the word infinity wasn't mentioned at all during the item.
Every time you look in our inbox, there's another email about this, so the response itself is threatening to be infinite. So, have we failed to do our homework? Well, no. We did discuss with Katie Steckles, who is very much a mathematician. She has a PhD and everything, whether the answer to 1 divided by 0 could be infinity. But just as Fermat's margin was too small to contain his remarkable proof, our slot on Radio 4 was too small to contain that discussion. Fortunately, much like Richard Nixon, we kept the recording. Now, when I saw this, I was discussing this with some friends, and I said, well, you can't do that. It's kind of infinity, but not really. So, to talk to me about it's kind of infinity, but not really. It sounds like you're stressing not really.
Yeah, I mean, that is very much kind of one way of thinking about it. So, you know, if you divide by a whole number, it kind of makes sense and we know how to do that. If you divide by something that's less than 1, the answer will actually get bigger. So, you know, if you divide by 2, the thing's going to get smaller. But if you divide by a half, that's kind of the opposite. That's the same as multiplying by 2. So as the thing you're dividing by gets smaller and smaller, closer and closer to 0, the thing that you get will get bigger and bigger. You know, if you divide by 0.00001, then the thing is going to get bigger. And the closer you get to 0, the bigger the thing that you get is going to get.
Okay, so that's the intuition for why, once you actually get to zero, the answer is infinity, but you're telling me that the answer is not infinity, so why not?
Well, if you think about it this way, if you're coming at it from the other side, so if you divide by minus a half, then you get a large negative number. If you divide by minus 0.0001, you'll get a very, very large negative number. So if you kind of come at it from the other direction, instead of getting closer and closer to infinity, whatever that might be, it's getting closer and closer to minus infinity, which is a very, very large number the other way. So there's no way that those two things kind of match up when you reach zero.
Oh, thanks again to Dr. Katie Snafford. You're listening to More or Less, and if you'd like to comment on anything we've said, or to point us in the direction of some statistical sleuthing, our email address is moreorless@bbc.co.uk. Remember when everyone raised a collective eyebrow when then US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld talked about the difference between known unknowns and unknown unknowns? Well, maybe there was a seed of wisdom in that. A new report out this week argues that when it comes to the effectiveness of government policy, it's time to get to know some of those unknowns. It's been written by David Halper, President Emeritus of the Behavioural Insights team, who, in a previous life, advised both Tony Blair and David Cameron on effective policies, and by David's colleague Dylan LaRue. I asked David Halper what problem his report was trying to address.
Most policy and most government, you would hope, is based on evidence, but it turns out often the evidence base is very, very thin. And governments are often doing this in parallel. So this report is really trying to look at the extent to which we produce and we use effectively evidence and how we can get much better at it, particularly learning from other countries and places, which turns out to be a really good idea.
So despite the fact that governments are spending serious money to educate children, pay benefits, or even put people in jail and then try to rehabilitate them, David says governments are doing this without really knowing which approaches work and which don't.
You know, there are lots of ways of trying to figure out what's going on in the world, causally, particularly doing interventions and things like randomized controlled trials, when you try and figure out, well, is this a better way of getting someone back to work, or reducing crime, or improving educational outcomes, or making someone live longer. And it turns out that in some areas, like particularly health, to some extent actually defense, we spend quite a lot of money on this kind of R&D to answer those types of questions. But there are lots of areas where we spend remarkably little, given the few billions, in fact trillions that we spend on education and home affairs and welfare. We do remarkably little primary research or R&D to figure out how to make it work better.
Let's park defence, which you can argue is a special case, and focus on health. David's report looked at the UK, US, Australia and Canada, and here's one example of the difference in research spending in the UK.
So in the Department of Health, there is a research budget in IHR, which is about 1.25 billion. There are also very substantial research councils as well. There are, back of your hand you can count several billion. We'll get to 3 to 5 billion very rapidly. Now, more is spent in the NHS than it is in education, but in schools alone we're spending about 60 billion odd a year. You can maybe identify, if you work hard, about 50 million that is spent on research.
About 0.1%. Right. David reckons that relative to the overall scale of spending, we spend 10 times as much on research into health as we do onto research into other areas of social policy, such as education, criminal justice, or policing. Maybe even more.
So it's a very, very big gap. We also see a big gap then in the production of evidence. If you assemble, well, how many of those kind of robust studies, randomized controlled trials particularly, are produced in health versus every other area, all of the social policy combined? It's around 20 to 1. Let's say the 20 times more randomized controlled trial experimental type studies done in health than everything else.
David's report is calling for some basic steps towards improving the situation. Things such as getting governments to publish and share any research they do in these underfunded policy areas, and funding researchers to amalgamate and evaluate any research that does exist, so policymakers have the best available evidence to work on. Thinks a lot could be learned. We could easily compare how different countries have dealt with the same problem, for example.
So let me push back on some of what you said then. So if I have a potential treatment for depression
that if it works in one population, it's probably going to work everywhere. Not necessarily, but that seems, human beings are the same the world over. If, on the other hand, I have a method for teaching literacy, well, that, if it works in England and Wales, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in France or Denmark. Different languages, different institutions, different traditions. So can we really hope to learn a lot from other countries, given that we're talking about social policy and these societies are different?
So I think there are limits here. You're absolutely right to highlight this point. It's often said you should at least take inspiration from other countries, but you shouldn't assume the thing will work in a different place, in a different population, will work when it's translated. And so you really want to use that as a starting point, try it out, test it, and replicate. But still, we shouldn't overstate that argument. So kids struggle with algebra the world over. And it's a reasonable question to say, well, does the Singapore Maths Mastery program work better, and would it work well in other places?
David Halpern, making the case for turning those known unknowns into known knowns. Never let it be said that our listeners are overly literal. They are just the right amount of literal. Thank you very much. Take this question from loyal listener Stephen Roylance. The impression we're repeatedly given by the media is that oil tankers, once launched, continue to circumnavigate the globe in one direction for the duration of their seagoing careers, due to the near impossibility of turning them around. Can we ask how long it actually takes to turn an oil tanker around? A fine question indeed. Government finances to NHS productivity, we talk about many an issue on this programme. Progress might be compared to turning around an oil tanker. But how long does that actually take? Step forward, Mel Irving.
I'm the advanced simulator manager of South Shields Marine School.
Oil tanker simulator, just what we need. There's more to Mel than a simulator too. He actually knows how to turn a tanker.
So I've had a seagoing career for 14 years on a variety of ships, from tankers, cargo ships, passenger vessels.
Mel's day job involves using a big old ship simulator. Imagine one of the fancy flight simulators, but much, much slower, to help captains learn how to pilot their vessels. Complete with a wheel to steer, big screens covered in digital oceans, and some of these sound effects. But you don't want to just sit there while Mel slowly turns a vessel in real time. Oh no, we're all impatient data nerds here, so let's do this the data nerd way, by running the simulation on a laptop. Can you program up and set everything ready to see how long it's going to take to turn around an oil tanker?
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll load an oil tanker. So I've chosen one that's 330 meters long.
That feels pretty long. Is that as long as they get, or does it get even longer than that?
No, they have been bigger. 330 meters is very, very typical of a VLCC today.
No, VLCC being very large cruise carrier?
Cruise carrier, yes.
Yeah.
And with that loaded, then I select what the parameters, so I'll have it set at full speed.
So we're on full speed. We're ready to turn this thing around. We're going to program a 180 turn.
Right, so I'll press.
Earlier, Moscow announced it had withdrawn the accreditation of 6 British diplomats in Russia. Here's our security correspondent, Frank Gallagher.
Baseless and ruthless is how the Foreign Development Office has described Russia's accusations that the 6 British diplomats had been expelled because they were spying. The FSB, Russia's successor to the KGB, said they'd been threatening Russia's security. The Foreign Office said that Britain's left Russia some weeks ago and had already been replaced. This does appear to be a tit-for-tat response to the expulsion in May of Russia's defence attaché in London.
You heard a little of that. Here's a little more. This is UK Deputy Permanent Representative, Ambassador James Kariuki, highlighting issues he said deserved more focus.
Just days ago, it came to light that Russia has received Iranian ballistic missiles used in prosecuting its illegal war against Ukraine. Transfer poses a direct threat to European security and stability elsewhere.
going to hear different views in the programme. Let's start with Shashank Joshi, defence editor of The Economist, a visiting fellow at the Department of War Studies, King's College in London. Shashank, in a few sentences, what do you think the West should do, and how seriously should it take Putin's threat?
I think that it should lift restrictions on the use of long-range weapons inside Russia, but I think that some restrictions are appropriate. I think that there is an military advantage in helping Russian high-value targets, but there's certain sorts of targets that Russia claims to have used its own drones in the past, like early warning radars used in nuclear weapons systems. I think those should be off limits, but I think some restrictions ought to be.
Right. Now, Shashank, one of the things that President Putin said, which he thought justified his claim that this is really the West or NATO or member states of NATO declaring war on Russia, is that these missiles, coordinates need to be inserted into by NATO personnel rather than Ukrainian personnel, because Ukraine can't do it. Thus, it is essentially NATO that's launching the missiles. What is the truth on that? Let's take the Storm Shadow start.
What we understand is that it is possible for these missiles to be used without US targeting data. But let's not forget, these are scarce missiles, they're very expensive, they're used against very high-value Russian targets, and therefore, for maximum effectiveness, to penetrate Russian air defenses, to get past Russian jamming, to make sure they reliably destroy their targets, I think it is correct that some degree of Western involvement, including data that can only be acquired by the US from its own sensitive means, including satellites, is necessary to reliably destroy some targets. So, in other words, it's more nuanced than NATO personnel are programming every single target in, but I think it is true to say that US data is important for certain targets for Storm Shadow.
Okay. What is the international law position on this issue? Do we become party to that war to supply weapons and coordinates for those weapons for Ukraine?
I think there's no single criterion that spells out when a country becomes a belligerent. But I'm not convinced that providing intelligence, whilst clearly a higher degree of participation in a weapons system, I'm not convinced that is co-belligerence. To give you an example of this, Evan, Chinese companies have provided overhead satellite data to the Russians at various points in this war to help with targeting strikes. Does that make China a co-belligerent of Russia? I think the answer is no. I'm not suggesting that's an exact parallel, of course it's not. And there are risks, but I don't deny that. I'm not one of those who dismisses any and all concerns over escalation. But I think that simply providing intelligence isn't enough. And what's really important here is within Ukraine itself, Western countries have been providing a significant degree of intelligence assistance at the very beginning of this war itself. So that in itself is not the threshold of whose profit represents a new stage in this conflict.
Now, Shashank, the Telegraph reporting from the US that Joe Biden is resisting calls to restrict use of these missiles. What are you expecting in terms of timing of an announcement? Will there be an announcement? Maybe they can just make a decision without announcing it.
My sense is that there will be no announcement, and that we should not expect an announcement. And I think there is concern, quite legitimately in government, that the frenzy around this decision is really disadvantageous to Ukrainian parties because it is making this decision seem considerably more escalated than it is. In the past, weapon systems have been provided and they've been used without this degree of fanfare. So I'm not expecting any dramatic announcement. Having said that, I'd be surprised if there was no change in policy at all in the coming weeks. I think you can see these debates taking place in Washington. But as anyone's expecting some big press conference at which prime ministers or heads of state announce that suddenly Ukraine is free to fire missiles into Russia at will, that isn't going to happen.
Shashank, thank you so much for that. Well, as I say, we'll be hearing various views in the programme. Earlier today, I spoke to a former US ambassador to the UK, Matthew Barson, was ambassador 2013 to 2017. First, I asked him how he felt US-UK relations.
When we use words like alignment and staying together, I think it's important that we don't expect or even want absolute uniformity. We sort of want unity without uniformity, because if everyone is exactly the same, it feels good for a second, but it's actually quite brittle. That is not how NATO works. It's not how the US and the UK work. It is okay to have differences. Understood. Right. We are facing this decision focused on each other. Iran is probably giving ballistic missiles to the Russians. Things have changed. The world is moving on. The US is considering changing the terms of engagement. Yeah. What should happen in your view? Essentially, Putin says you do it, you're all Russia. In your run-up to that question, I was nodding my head because you've seen the battlefield has changed, and therefore our position has changed along with it, and so the US and the UK and the other partners. So I think the signaling, what I've been reading, public statements this week, it seems to be leading to what you're saying, which is a reassessment that they need new tools. Talk to me about UK-US relations in 2 months' time. Obviously, there's an election coming up in the United States. I don't know, maybe Keir Starmer. Right. No, sounded. I mean, it's a sort of phony period, isn't it? It's a slightly weird period here, and we're making some quite big decisions now, and yet it is one of these moments where the differences in our G1 global democracies really do come to the fore. You know, when the changeover happened with Harris at the top of the ticket away from President Biden, you hear Americans be like, so late, and still at that time, there were 2.5 British election cycles worth of time left between now and election day, and that seems very rushed for us. So, look, I think look back at all the different prime ministers you all have had, even since I left in 2017. So this relationship can handle change of who's in the head of government role, and it has, and it will. Former US Ambassador Matthew Barnes will hear more different views later in the program. Right now, though, 17 minutes past 5. Charles, give us some of the other headlines. Former Metropolitan Police Officer has been jailed for 16 months for stealing cash from the man who died after collapsing in the street. Craig Carter took around £115 from Claudio Granati in September 2022. More than 30,000 workers at the US plane manufacturer Boeing have gone on strike for the first time in 16 years. And the footballer Cristiano Ronaldo has become the first person to reach 1 billion combined followers across his social media accounts. Billion. Charles, thank you. The presenter of the BBC series, The Repair Shop, Jay Blades, has been engaging in controlling and coercive behaviour.
阿細 B 頭先咧，嗰支奶咧，我擺咗paracetamol加維他命加受所有佢食嗰啲嘢，但係佢唔肯飲。係啊，佢依家嗰支奶咪到咗。如果到咗你再俾奶佢飲就佢頭先有啲燒，我唔記得落第37.8。
where members of the public and others bring in much loved items that are desperately in need of restoration. Replace and repair the items and try to restore them to their former glory. In fact, one person who's taken part in it was actually the king while he was still Prince Charles. So that's the popularity of the show in a nutshell. It's also won a BAFTA award for its impact on audiences. Now, we had a statement earlier today from Westminster Police saying that Mr. Blades had appeared at Magistrates Court this morning, charged with controlling coercive behaviour following an incident where officers were called to an address earlier this year on the 3rd of May. The court documents say that his alleged behaviour was towards his estranged wife, and that the alleged behaviour included physical and emotional abuse. As you say, there's an issue, of course, with his appearance in the schedules. A appearance on David and Jay's touring tool shed alongside David Jason, as you say, will now not be shown this evening. He was last on the BBC on Wednesday evening in an episode of The Repair Shop. The moment next Wednesday, another episode of The Repair Shop featuring him is due to be transmitted, but of course I'm sure the BBC will be looking very, very carefully at that over the next couple of days. Also, he was Chancellor at Buckinghamshire University, but a spokesperson for them today said that he resigned with immediate effect, and he's due to appear at Worcester Crown Court in a month's time.
Thank you, China is raising its retirement age, quite low in China at the moment, a reflection of historically relatively low life expectancy, but lives there are getting much longer. 78 is the average life expectancy now. So the retirement age is going up. Men's retirement will go up from 60 to 63. For white collar women, it goes up to 58, and for blue collar women, it goes to 55, going up from 50 to 55. So significant increases in retirement age, but still rather lower than ours. I'm joined by Professor Jane Duckett, Chair of Political International Studies at Glasgow University, something of a China watcher. Jane, talk us through what is going on here, and have they waited perhaps rather a long time with closing the murder investigation?
We've come to the view right now that there are no viable lines of inquiry. We've convicted, as you know, 2 people in 2012, but there are still people 3.
Now's a good time to reflect on where the case is and analyse the proposed official review of the murder, with negotiations on it between the Met and Stephen's family nearing an end. The review, which the Mayor of London has said must satisfy the Lawrence family, was announced following a long-running investigation into the murder I've done for the BBC. Last year, we publicly identified a major suspect in the case, Matthew White, for the first time, and exposed decades of Met failures relating to him prior to his death 3 years ago.
We knew there was 5, possibly 6. Now we know that there was 6. And the one that just passed away was probably the key one who probably caused Stephen's murder, and they did nothing about it.
The review has the potential for the case to be reopened should fresh or neglected lines of inquiry be identified. Negotiations on it are now nearing a conclusion. It can really only end in one of 2 ways, with the setting up of a review that the Lawrence family supports, or with one they do not support, and which therefore may not take place at all. The Met has proposed that it should have a relatively narrow focus, looking at recent decision-making. This review would essentially be paper-based. Stephen's family want a far broader review, with no limits on what can be examined, meaning much earlier decisions and investigations would be in scope. The family think the Met may have neglected chances to bring the other killers to justice.
There's still lines of inquiry for them to follow up on. There's still 3 suspects out there, and I'm sure there's witnesses that probably could help them if they're interested.
The Met itself now accepts the first investigation into the murder was a failure. That investigation was lambasted in 1999 by the landmark Macpherson report.
Good evening. The outcome of the judicial inquiry by Sir William Macpherson, as expected, is a damning account of the investigation of a racist crime bungled by racist officers. But it goes much further.
The Met bluntly has seemed content to lay the blame for everything that has gone wrong with the case on the first investigation. But blaming it all on the first investigation creates 2 major traps. First, people think there is nothing new to find in the evidence it produced, given how heavily examined it's been. And 2, blaming it all on
the leader of the Alba Party, the Conservative peer Annabel Goldie, and we've had hopes for the Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar, but he's not well, so we are grateful to the Energy Minister Michael Shanks, who will be joining us instead, and I hope you can too. We're live as ever at 8 p.m.
Thank you, Alex. That is them. Right now, that you're listening to PM, and we're going to have a summary of the news from Charles Carroll.
The UK has dismissed as completely baseless Russian accusations that 6 British diplomats were spying on Moscow. The announcement follows a fresh warning from Vladimir Putin not to let Ukraine target Russia with Western missiles. Nicholas Starmer is visiting Washington and is expected to discuss the issue with President Biden. An 18-year-old man has been arrested by Bedfordshire police investigating a triple murder in a flat in Luton. The victims were found early this morning in the Marsh Farm area of the town. The force says that it's not looking for anyone else. A woman has been found not guilty of a richly aggravated public order offence after being photographed to the pro-Palestinian protest with a placard that depicted then Prime Minister and Home Secretary Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman as coconuts. The phrase is used to accuse people from ethnic minorities of acting like white people. Westminster Magistrates Court accepted that Mariha Hussein's placard was part of the genre of political satire. The Ministry of Justice says the prison population fell by nearly 2,200 people over the past week. More than 1,700 inmates were released on Tuesday as part of a scheme to relieve prison overcrowding. Broadcaster Jay Blades has been charged with controlling or coercive behaviour towards his wife. The 54-year-old, who's presented with a Meerschaum on BBC television since 2017, appeared before magistrates and was bailed. He's due to appear at Worcester Crown Court next month. The High Court has quashed plans to build the UK's first deep coal mine in more than 30 years. The judge ruled that giving the go-ahead for the scheme had been legally flawed. West Cumbria Mining had originally been given permission to develop the site at Whitehaven by the previous Conservative government in 2022, before it was challenged by climate campaign groups. And the former England football manager Sven-Göran Eriksson has been remembered as a loving father who enjoyed salsa dancing at his funeral in Sweden. Eriksson was the first non-British manager of the England team between 2001 and 2006. He died aged 76 last month. Around 600 people attended Eriksson's funeral today, including David Beckham.
Thank you, Charles. Now, does President Putin lie? It is the question that's been asked by geopolitical thinkers at the moment. Is it correct to treat NATO as being a war with Russia should Western countries have to permit Ukraine to move their longer itself? So, now, Putin's been around for a while. So, what does experience tell us about this? Sarah Raisin, BBC's Eastern Europe correspondent, and joins us now. So, Sarah, does
It's a big question, that one, and I think the answer is yes and no. I mean, Vladimir Putin definitely likes to talk tough. That's been part of his image from the very start. If you remember, more than 2 decades ago, all those pictures of him in fighter jets or on horseback. And he does make threats, and he can carry through on them. I was thinking back, and I remember one from his very early days when he was Prime Minister, and he was facing separatist forces in Chechnya. And back then, in a moment of fury, he vowed he'd wipe them out, even on the toilet, although he was a lot cruder than that in his actual words. And what followed was the flattening of Grozny, the Chechen capital, in Russian bombing raids. And then a few years later, when Chechen militants took over a school in Beslan, Vladimir Putin kept to his word again. He wiped out the gunmen in that school, even though 186 children died in the process. And he hasn't changed. But most of the time, if I think of it, Putin's threats are much less overt, they're more implicit. So, for example, he once talked about hating traitors, for example, and then remember what happened to Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, the former double agent poisoned with a Novichok nerve agent. Often, though, I think Putin won't threaten something in advance, and he'll even lie that he's not going to do something and then do it anyway. That's what happened in 2022 with a massive build-up of troops on Ukraine's border. Putin said they wouldn't invade, but of course they did. So if he's a man who does what he says he won't do, then will he follow through on actual threats? I think since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin and his officials have made plenty of threats. Dmitry Medvedev, you'll remember he was president for a while, and he
talked about improving these air defences if Western restrictions were lifted, and he asking the rhetorical question as to why we couldn't supply from Russia weapons of the same class to regions around the world where they could target us. So there's quite a lot to assess, and there will also, I imagine, be some intelligence which we don't have access to from outside, of course. And then, of course, the diplomats and the military advisors have to sit down and just thrash out the pros and cons of making a change in our policy.
Okay, well, let's just think it's a step ahead. If, for example, as a result of the West deciding to let Ukraine use these weapons equal to Russia, if that happens, and then Russia, let's say, bombs an airbase in Eastern Europe somewhere, which that has been suggested by Russian analysts, including the retaliation, what would the West do then? Would we be asking that question? How would we respond as Russia responds? Do we sort of look at it and think two steps ahead?
Oh, certainly. And I don't know what the answer would be. We're on the outside, but that's exactly the kind of analysis that can go on. Once you've made your situational awareness or assessment
thinking about the message he is trying to send to us. And we need to think about the sort of message we need to say to him. For example, we did show restraint with putting those restrictions from the United States on the supply of longer-range weapons to Ukraine. Russia has not responded with any comparable restraint. There's been firing missiles, glide bombs, all the rest at civilian targets in Ukraine, at Ukraine's energy supply system, at apartment blocks, all in direct contravention of international law.
I mean, there's one school of thought that would say because President Putin has now tried to up the ante to threaten really escalation in the event that the West concedes its concession to Ukraine. The fact that he's done that means the West can't listen to it. We have to let Ukraine now do this because we can't show ourselves weak in the face of Russian threat.
That's certainly a valid consideration. This is all about mutual signaling to or pro, and you have to be very careful that the signal to something not misunderstood. But equally, that the absence of a signal is not itself taken as a signal for weakness.
What is your opinion to what the West would do?
Personally, I would be in favour of sending a firm signal. We can't intimidate into not failure to support Ukraine given Russian behaviour. It would be different if we didn't have the appalling evidence of indiscriminate attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and targets.
Interestingly, the Russian envoy at the UN has just said NATO will be a direct party responsibility against nuclear power. I think you shouldn't forget about this and think about the consequences. So that's what Russia said in the UN.
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Because that's part of the intimidatory message they're trying to send.
Now, I want you to imagine that you're advising President Putin. You know his objectives. You're advising him on those objectives. You're not allowed to say, stop the war, come out of Ukraine. Because he's thinking through 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps ahead, presumably. What does he actually lavish production through?
They do, and that's kind of part of the problem, I think, that we've now become used to plenty of streamers who have pretty much bottomless pits. We've become used to high-end television that's made for absolutely huge sums of money that our channels, Channel 4, Channel 5, BBC and ITV, can't hope to match. So, and also then they're making products that will sell around the world, whereas of course what we want our channels in the UK to make are stories that speak to us and speak about our lives. And those programmes that they make don't sell internationally. So for example, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which was an enormous hit earlier in the year and won National Television Awards just the other night, they couldn't sell it internationally, and ITV, the chair of ITV, said not long ago that they took a hit of £1 million on production. So it's a very strange time when seemingly there's huge amounts of money, but actually the amount of work available is a great deal less than it used to be.
Right, so it's a lot of upmarket production, not very expensive production, a number of big global hits, but things like Doctors struggle because they're now competing against those, and that's where that's sort of mid-market, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, mid-market and also the soaps have been very badly hit, but it's interesting that the soaps haven't been badly hit because they're losing viewers. They've been badly hit simply because they're low-hanging fruit, and the channels need to cut budgets. They need to find savings somewhere, and so they're the first to go. But they're not losing viewers. They're still amongst the most popular shows in the UK.
How are you earning your money now? This Doctors series, long-running product, is coming to an end. What are you doing?
Well, so like every freelancer, like Jenny mentioned there, the freelance life is one of when you're not actually contracted onto writing something on a show. You spend an awful lot of time working for free, coming up with ideas, trying to sell them in the hope that you will then make that money at a certain point. So freelance life is one of feast and famine, really, and at the moment it's famine. But I am like many freelancers across the industry.
Philip Rowe, script writer, thanks for that account of what's happening in television production. 13 minutes to 6 now. Charles will give us a last look at some other of the day's headlines.
The accountancy firm PwC has been banned in China for 6 months because of problems with its audit of the property company Evergrande. Regulators have also fined PwC the equivalent of £47 million. A Metropolitan Police officer who was fined £1,500 for assault after wrongly arresting a woman for bus fare evasion has had his conviction quashed. And Uma Mahmood, an 18-year-old who appeared in the first series of Andrew Flintoff's TV show Field of Dreams, has died in a car crash.
Very sad news there. Thank you, Charles. It's time to finish our PM mini-series, How to Raise 20 Figures. In the series, we've explored some of the options for technical tax rates, ones that Rachel Reeves may be considering for her budget on the 30th of October. Is there potential for tidying up the tax system in an economically logical way, as well as bringing more money in? Well, we've looked at quite a few areas now. To be honest, the serious money seems possibly to come from the favourable tax treatment of pension contributions in the national insurance and income tax system, which we have discussed. But we have a last tax to examine, inheritance tax, which most people won't have enough money to pay when they die. Many go to a lot of effort to avoid it. I spoke to tax expert Dan Needle, founder of the think tank Tax Policy Associates, about the tax and how you might report it, and why so few actually end up having to pay.
Inheritance tax has a high load, and it only kicks in when you are quite wealthy. If you're a married couple with wealth in your family house, unless your assets are £1 million or more, you pay no inheritance tax at all.
And there are lots of other allowances as well, aren't there?
There are lots of reliefs and allowances, most of which were very rational at the time they were created, not so rational now. Take agricultural property, for instance, so it makes complete sense that if you have a small holding owned by a family, if the couple that owns it dies and their children inherit it and they have to pay 40% inheritance tax on a small farm in Norfolk, say, then they're unlikely to be able to fund that. They would have to sell the farm, break up the farm, and that's undesirable. So having an exemption for small agricultural holdings completely makes sense. The problem is, the exemption isn't for small agricultural holdings, it's for all agricultural holdings. So if I was a builder, it could make absolute sense for me to go around the country, hoover it up into woodland and agricultural land, and create a tax-exempt asset for children.
Right. Now, if you, Dan, were wanting to raise money from inheritance tax, where would you do it? How would you do it? I mean, that might be one example, but there are other examples.
So I wouldn't increase the rate. I think to expand the base and eliminate some of the exemptions that are very hard to justify. One example is there's an exemption for business property, and that's supposed to be small businesses. But out of an historical accident, it got extended to shares that are listed on markets that aren't the main market. So, for example, A, the alternative investment market, worth about £100 million market capital. If you have shares in a company listed on A, as long as it's carrying on a business, those shares are completely exempt from inheritance tax. So there are funds out there who package up AIM shares that qualify for inheritance tax relief, and if you sell your shares, or let's say whatever other assets you have, and you buy one of these AIM funds, and as long as you live for 2 years, or if we abolish the exemption for AIM shares and other market shares, you could raise somewhere north of £1 billion.
Okay, that's getting to be interesting, isn't it, to a chancellor? Something else that's not taxed on the inheritance schemes, if I have a big pension pot and I die, can I leave that without inheritance tax on it?
You can. There's a slight catch, which is that if you die age 75 or older, then when your children or whoever's inheriting take cash out of the pension pot, they're taxed on that as income tax.
Is there a way in which you say, instead of charging the estate, when people get money out of the estate, they do just pay it as income tax? They just treat it as income in their income tax?
So you could do that, but it gets quite complicated. It suddenly becomes a really good idea to leave lots of money to my 10 newly discovered cousins, the Cayman Islands, who are outside the UK and pay no income tax. So to prevent that, you then have to have rules that say, okay, but we're going to pretend foreigners pay income tax. Then you have the problem of actually collecting the tax from lots of disparate beneficiaries. So you probably have to have a rule that says, okay, we'll collect it in the hands of the estate. And by the time you've dealt with those special cases, which is not 19 years, you'll have the current system. It's a bit more complicated.
How much can a chancellor get out of inheritance tax, do you think, in ways that are not going to penalise, let's call them ordinary working families who happen to live in a house that might have inflated in value to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds over their life?
If I ruled the world, I would scrap many or most of these exemptions, and I would reduce the rate to make it lower than 40%. And if you don't want to do that, if you're just saying your aim here is to collect more tax, you could collect £2 billion, maybe £2.5 billion just by collecting it.
One of the interesting things about inheritance tax is I've seen Poland, and even though most people don't end up paying it, it is just about the most unpopular tax in the country. People feel there's something very unfair about taxing people in their life and then taxing them again when they die.
We did see Poland because it's often said, people say this because they don't understand. People don't understand that they're not going to personally pay inheritance tax. So we did see Poland where we said to people, inheritance tax only applies if you have £1 million of assets. Do you believe inheritance tax is fair or unfair? And still, 70% of the country say it's unfair. And no amount of explaining better is going to fix that.
Dan Needle on inheritance tax there has been seen as a possibility for Rachel Reeves to come to the fight. We're going to box all of those tax ideas up, and they'll be on BBC Sounds Out. Now, for the last couple of weeks, the village in Bridgend County in South Wales, Bettws, has been plagued by swarms of flies. They're more than just a buzzing nuisance. Ordinary life is impossible. As resident Melanie Simmons, landlady of the Oddfellow Arms, told Johnny Dunn in The World at One.
You open your front door, somebody walk in, it is just inundated. And we're not talking a small amount, we've in the hundreds. And I've got a new baby here, the minute you take the bottle into his mouth, you've got flies laughing at you straight away, so you've got to discard all of that and start all over again. So I haven't used the fly trains, I'm using the fly strip. They will come down, they'll have 6 fly strips up, and then 45 minutes when you count them, 205 flies already from them. You come in, they're landing on top covers, you're trying to dish food out, when you're dishing the food out, by the time you've got to your third plate to dish out, there could be 7 or 8 already sitting on your first plate.
Horrendous. None of us need persuading that it's awful. But the arrival of the flies has been a mystery. Why on earth have they come? Can we solve it now? Dr. Erica McAllister is an entomologist and senior curator at the Natural History Museum. Erica, thank you for joining us. What do you suspect is going on here?
Well, it's a little confusing to start with because we don't actually know what flies they are. So all the images I've seen so far, all of the sites have got completely different flies. So in layman's terms, basically it's sort of cats, dogs or St. Badges. So these 3 different families of flies, of which I suspect there is one, do very different things. So if we go with the one we do suspect it is, and I've just retrospect the evidence there, which is Musca autumnalis. So many people have heard of Musca domestica. So that's the common domestic fly. It's been with us for millennia. It loves humans because it loves our ways. But we have really cleaned ourselves up. So this fly is of less importance around us. But Musca autumnalis, this likes agriculture. This likes the let's say the effluence, what the horses and cows leave behind in the field. And this could build up, or this could be trapped in a treatment centre or something like that. Something along these lines, which adds that to this weird weather, this warm, mild climate, and then suddenly you can see this population explosion.
I would have thought farming somewhere would have to be in the investigation zone, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
How often do we get these kind of mass swarms of flies descending on our coast?
So the last one actually is in a similar area, which was about 2018, and that was caused by a metal work. So there was a lot of different chemicals being used there, which again caused the flies to come in, and the flies went, oh, this is marvellous, great habitat, great food, really good environment, cool, and they do what flies do, they multiply. So if the conditions are good, they've got their food, their substrate, a nice environment in which to live in, these little flies are very good at making more little flies, and I'm sure the little village can testament, the area can say. And so they explode their population. So some of them, within 2 weeks, can be
you know, that's their life cycle, if they're really good.
Absolutely delighted with this decision. We have been absolutely vindicated because our case has succeeded on all grounds.
Jake Blaze, the presenter of the BBC show The Repair Shop, has been charged with controlling and coercive behaviour. More than 30,000 workers at US plane maker Boeing have gone on strike after turning down a 25% pay rise.
Our members rejected the contract by 94.6%.
A man from Sunderland has become the first person to be convicted of riot during the disorder this summer. The Foreign Office has dismissed claims by Russia that 6 British diplomats were spying on Moscow as completely baseless. The Kremlin have stripped the officials involved of their accreditation. BBC News has been told the diplomats left Russia weeks ago. Last night, President Putin issued a stark warning to Western allies of Ukraine, insisting that if they allowed Kiev to use long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russia, they would be directly involved in the conflict. Keir Starmer will discuss the issue with President Biden in Washington tonight. Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley has this report.
The announcement of Russia's move against the 6 British diplomats came early this morning on state-run TV. It showed photographs of them, along with the words Spy Factory. The FSB, which replaced the Soviet-era KGB, said their actions had threatened Russia's security and that their accreditation had been terminated in response to what it called numerous unfriendly steps taken by London. Shortly afterwards came a statement from the Foreign Office, which has asked us not to identify the diplomats, describing the accusations against them as completely baseless. Officials say they're now back in the UK after losing their accreditation in mid-August, which begs the question why Russia is making this public now. The timing of Sir Keir Starmer in Washington to discuss missiles for Ukraine seems designed to send a message. Lord Peter Ricketts is a former National Security Advisor and head of the Foreign Office.
The timing is too coincidental. This is Russian punishment for the UK being seen as a cheerleader for supplying weapons to Ukraine. And the reasons they give in their statement are completely trumped up. I mean, we're told that the Russian spy agency has documents from the Department and the Foreign Office which say that the task of this is ensuring Russia's strategic defeat against Ukraine. Well, surprise, surprise, that's been British declared policy for 2.5 years.
But tensions have been deepening in recent weeks. In May, the British government expelled Russia's defence attaché and set a time limit on how long Moscow's diplomats can stay here, part, it said, of an attempt to dismantle Russian intelligence gathering in the UK. The Foreign Office is suggesting the move against the British embassy staff was a tit for tat. But this is also a moment of high stakes in the international response to the conflict in Ukraine. The Russian embassy in London put out a statement on X, saying the UK appeared to be edging towards what it called a new, highly perilous phase of escalation.
This evening, President Zelensky has again called for permission to hit military bases inside Russia as a means of preventing attacks on Ukrainian territory. Officials in Kiev say Russian airstrikes have killed 11 people across the country in the past 24 hours. Our political editor Chris Mason, who's travelling with Sir Keir Starmer, has sent this report ahead of his meeting with President Biden.
A new Prime Minister and his Foreign Secretary were this lunchtime in the long corridors and beneath the giant chandeliers of the British Embassy here in Washington. Sir Keir Starmer and David Lammy diplomatically limbering up for this evening's meeting with the President. The briefing of the UK's Ambassador, Karen Pierce. Publicly, words are chosen with caution, not least because the diplomatic shuffling in plain sight, Mr. Lammy was in Kyiv just days ago, has itself prompted a response from Moscow. At the heart of this trip, a big strategic call. Allow Ukraine to fire Western missiles into Russia or not? With Kyiv edging towards yes to that, being yes. A public definitive answer is not expected quite yet though, seeking Western coordination and agreement, and quickly, the aim for now, as some threat about what Moscow might do in retaliation, others urge the West to crack on. A conflict without obvious end presents too no end of thorny dilemmas based around a recurring theme. What could be the consequences of action, and what could be the consequences of inaction?
President Putin has said NATO would be directly involving itself in the war by allowing Ukraine to use the long-range missiles inside Russia, because they need to use the alliance's satellites to find the targets. At the United Nations Security Council, Russia's ambassador, Vasily Nebensia, has echoed that statement and reminded members that Russia is a nuclear power. More from our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera.
Storm Shadow missiles would be launched from Ukrainian fighter jets with the trigger pulled by Ukrainians. So why does Vladimir Putin claim their use would mean NATO is directly involved in the war? Part of the answer may come from the way the missiles are targeted. They rely on being programmed with data about the terrain they fly over, and the US tends to be the main provider of the kind of satellite and imagery data required. And the truth is that the provision of Western intelligence for Ukraine's operations has long been known to Moscow, even if it's little spoken of by Western governments. And Storm Shadow itself has already been used in Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2018 and considers its own territory. Western spies say President Putin uses saber-rattling to sow division and doubt in his adversaries, but believe he has no interest in an all-out war with NATO. So the notion that the use of Storm Shadow crosses a red line significantly different from those that he has drawn in the past, and which NATO has already crossed, has been met with scepticism.
And much of that scepticism has come from one of Ukraine's neighbours, Poland. The Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, has urged allies to not place too much importance on Mr. Putin's comments. From Warsaw, here's our Eastern Europe correspondent, Sarah Rainsford.
For the 2.5 years of Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, Kiev's Western allies, especially Washington, have weighed every move carefully, worried about Russia's response, anxious not to escalate. But here, on NATO's eastern flank, governments have been reading Russia up close for many years, and they tend to be less hesitant. The Latvian foreign minister told the BBC you can't dismiss the butcher in the Kremlin, as she calls Vladimir Putin. The war on Ukraine is clear proof of that. But NATO's nuclear deterrent is strong, she argued, and Russia shouldn't be allowed to intimidate. Here, in Poland, the Prime Minister argued that the West shouldn't attach too much importance to Vladimir Putin's latest comments. Donald Tusk said the Russian leader was trying to put the West off helping Ukraine, but he believes his words should do the absolute opposite. His Foreign Minister, Radek Sikorski, has long argued.
Making no comment, but prior to the general election, Labour was opposed to the mine. West Cumbria Mining said it was looking at the judgment. It's possible they could yet launch their own legal challenge to today's decision. A saga which has lasted more than 7 years could yet face more legal wrangling before its fate is finally decided.
The BBC television presenter Jay Blades has been charged with engaging in controlling or coercive behaviour towards his wife. The broadcaster who hosts the repair shop has been bailed to appear at Worcester Crown Court next month. Here's our entertainment correspondent, Lisa Mazimba.
Jay Blades has been the main presenter of the BAFTA-winning The Repair Shop since the series began in 2017. On the show, viewers, including on one occasion The King, bring in much-loved items in need of restoration. West Mercia Police say that Mr Blades appeared at Kidderminster Magistrates Court charged with controlling and coercive behaviour. A spokesperson said that the charges came after officers were called to an address on the 3rd of May. According to court documents, his alleged behaviour was towards his estranged wife and included physical and emotional abuse. Jay Blades was due to appear on BBC One this evening alongside David Jason in a repeat of the programme David and Jay's Touring Toolshed. It was replaced by another show. And the spokesperson for Buckinghamshire New University says he's resigned as its Chancellor with immediate effect. Jay Blades is due to appear at Worcester Crown Court in a month's time.
Workers at some of the aerospace company Boeing's most important factories have walked out on strike after overwhelmingly rejecting a new contract offer, including a 25% pay rise. This week involves more than 30,000 workers, mainly at sites in Washington State and Oregon in the US. The vote is a major setback for Boeing's management as it struggles to overcome a safety and quality control crisis. Here's our business correspondent, Theo Leggett.
It was late in the evening in Seattle when the result of the vote was announced by the IAM union, and it was emphatic.
Our members rejected the contract by 94.6%.
This was a contract offer which Boeing had described as historic, and which union leaders said was probably the best they'd ever negotiated. It promised higher pay, lower healthcare costs, and a reduction in compulsory overtime. Yet workers gathered in the room celebrated the rejection. And shortly afterwards, their colleagues on the production lines downed tools. The contract row has exposed a deep rift between Boeing and a crucial part of its workforce, which has its roots in past labour disputes going back some 16 years. It comes at a time when the aerospace giant is already wrestling with serious quality control problems in its factories and is attempting to overhaul its safety culture. The shutdown is likely to affect production of the best-selling 737 MAX and the 777. Analysts say a prolonged stoppage could cost the company and its suppliers billions of dollars. In a statement, Boeing said it remained committed to resetting relationships with its employees and the union, and was ready to get back to the negotiating table.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. The main news so far, completely baseless and clearly ludicrous. The Foreign Office has dismissed Russian accusations that 6 British diplomats in Moscow were spies. Plans for the UK's first new coal mine in 30 years at Whitehaven in Cumbria have been quashed by the High Court. And still to come, why there may be fewer trans people in England and Wales.
Hello again. 你有冇簽 contract 㗎？嗰份工。
Terminally ill have said it is now inarguable that the public wants the law changed.
有冇 contract 俾你睇？
Assembled to consider the issue as a citizens' jury showed a majority
好似未睇。
But the permanent citizens dismissed it.
我諗住即係完全確定咗先同人講，即係教會啲人講。咁我係咪已經完全確定係？唔係俾人呃，但係我想即係完全知道係已經會發生，即係你會收有人工啊之類嗰啲。即係可以就係你講。係。係。OK， 即係做咗 即係咪做咗 DBS check， 真係可以開工，跟住先會出人工？咩意思？即係 DBS 啊，做完之後，你之後可以做嘢，跟住先可以簽 contract。咁另外嗰個係幾時過嚟屋企㗎？你講係啊，佢話會過嚟㗎嘛。哦 ，OK。哦，咁好啦，拜拜。拜拜。
Since then, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Spain, and California have all introduced a so-called right to die, and the Westminster government has reconfirmed the Prime Minister's pledge that MPs will be given time and a vote on the issue at some point.
A man from Sunderland has become the first person to be convicted of the charge of riot as a result of his son's disorder. Kieran Usher, who's 32, pleaded guilty in Newcastle Town Court. He was accused of playing an active role in what the prosecution called mob violence on the 2nd of August. Here's our UK correspondent, Daniel Sanford.
Of the more than 600 people charged so far in England following the summer's riots, over 400 have been charged with violent disorder, an offence that carries a maximum sentence of 5 years. But 4 people have been charged with the even more serious offence of riot. All of them were alleged to have been involved in fighting with the police in Sunderland on the 2nd of August. Appearing at Newcastle Crown Court, Kieran Usher became the first to plead guilty to riot. The Crown Prosecution Service said he was still
sorry for the significant delay in contacting the police. They
up after the J report found at least 1,400 girls were abused, trafficked, groomed by gangs and led in Moscow between 1997 and 2013. A teacher who carried a placard at a pro-Palestinian protest depicting Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman as coconuts has been found not guilty of racially aggravated unlawful offence. Prosecution said Mariha Hussein, who's 37, had crossed the line from political expression to racial insult. Her defence successfully argued the placard was satirical. Our correspondent Simon Jones was at Westminster Magistrates Court in central London.
Maria Hussein wept in court as she was cleared by a judge. Last November, she attended a pro-Palestinian protest in central London, carrying a placard showing the faces of the then Prime Minister and Home Secretary superimposed on coconuts under a palm tree. The prosecution argued coconut was a well-known racial slur, suggesting that someone was brown on the outside but white on the inside. In other words, the court had a race traitor, less brown and black than they should be. The defence argued the placard was a critique of Suella Braverman's Miranda policy. This judge, Vanessa Roy, concluded it was in the genre of political satire, but Hussein was exercising her right to freedom of expression. She spoke outside court.
The damage done to my reputation and image can never be undone, and I am proud to defend the principle that our language will talk to you. This will deal everything, agonizing my family and I. Instead of enjoying my pregnancy, I've been vilified in the media, I've lost my career, been dragged to the court system in what can only be described as a politically motivated show trial.
The Crown Prosecution Service insisted there had been enough evidence to bring the case to court, but said it accepted the judge's verdict.
The chief executive of the Sexual Assault Support Service in Edinburgh, Mridul Wadhwa, has stepped down after a review found it had failed to protect women-only spaces. The independent report concluded that some women had been damaged by their experience at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre. In a statement, it said the time was right for a change of leadership. An 18-year-old who appeared on the BBC One show Freddie Flintoff's Field of Dreams has died in a car crash in Lancashire. Umar Mahmood was driving an Audi A3 Sport that veered off the road in Preston late on Tuesday. A 16-year-old boy in the back seat was also killed. Umar Mahmood, a keen cricketer, was featured on the BBC series 2 years ago. A review has found the number of transgender people living in England and Wales may have been overestimated by the census data in 2021. The Office for National Statistics said some people who do not speak fluent English may have misunderstood the question. The data should be treated as being in development. Inside Social Affairs editor Alison Holden.
The census, which happens every 10 years, gathers detailed information about everyone living in the UK on a particular day. It measures how the population is changing, which provides important information for planning services for the future. In the 2021 census, for the first time, people in England and Wales were asked, is the gender you identify with the same as your sex registered at birth? According to statisticians at the ONS, about 262,000 people, approximately 0.5% of the population, answered no, so they were recorded as transgender. Having analysed the responses, ONS now says there was the potential for bias, as some that responded who had lower levels of English proficiency may have given the answer by mistake. So the impact is likely to be small, but advises against using the stat for local level planning. The ONS says other information in the census is considered fully accurate.
The mobile phone companies Vodafone and Three have dismissed claims by competition watchdog that their proposed merger would increase customer bills. Competition Markets Authority said the tie-up would also reduce service. Our technology reporter Graham Fraser has more details.
At present, Vodafone and Three are among the 4 biggest mobile providers in the UK. Between them, they have around 27 million customers. The CMA thinks any merger could adversely affect how much consumers pay and the service they get. It did say any tie-up could improve the quality of mobile networks and accelerate next generation 5G, but added that Vodafone and Three's claims about these possible improvements were overstated. Stuart McIntosh, who is leading the regulator's investigation, is also worried that the merger would make it more difficult for smaller operators such as Lebara and Sky Mobile to choose networks if the bigger companies get a good deal.
We're particularly concerned about this because those
wholesale providers are very often focused on the value end of the market, so they're providing very good value services to customers who are perhaps not able to afford to pay high prices.
Vodafone and Three have disputed the CMA's findings, saying that the merger would lead to an additional investment of £11 billion. They say that the money would go to improving services and closing the digital divide. And Vodafone's CEO for European markets, Ahmed Essam, said the tie-up would actually improve competition.
Night Sleeper departs on Sunday on BBC iPlayer.
Here on BBC Radio 4, some words of comfort and reassurance now from Andy Zoltzman.
Are you an American cat or dog? Are you worried that you've been nibbled at, chewed, or swallowed by someone from another country? Then you might be entirely fictional. Do you think you might be a made-up animal? Don't worry, it's perfectly normal. Things often get invented at this time of the American political cycle. And remember, if you want to take your non-existent animal mind off the tribulations of being in a federal pawn in the chess game that is a US presidential election, you're always welcome to listen to the news quiz. Hello, welcome to the news quiz. I am Andy Zoltzman, and our team this week in a alarming report for state of the NHS and the first and possibly last presidential debate in the US election. Our teams are Team Reform or Die against Team Perform and Lie. Our team is from Team Rod and Team Panel. Team Rod is Simon Evans and Glenn Moore. Team Panel, real leader and journalist and co-host of the Pod Save the UK podcast, Coco Khan. And Coco and Ray, we have our first question. Who this week put the wind into looming threat of a long cold winter?
Well, I think we know who that is. It's Mr. Starmer. So the latest iteration in this quite sad story about the liberty allowance is that there was a vote and Labour won quite sizably. So Labour had a massive majority, so it was expected that they would win. But it's interesting to see how many from Labour voted against. Interestingly, 52 MPs abstained this time, and I think we can all say that they were very, very scared of Keir Starmer. So it's been a controversial policy, but it is going to happen. Majorities are really interesting because, in general, government that has a sizable majority try and do something extremely radical. So Thatcher was a privatisation project, Tony Blair it was devolution, constitutional changes, with Johnson. He was too flustered to do much. What Labour are going to do, we don't know. So at the moment, we're continuing with what I call the heaven knows I'm miserable now. Keir Starmer will find a department, face the nation and say, I'm sorry, it's bad. You know, today, that's why I'm here, the police minister was at a conference talking to an audience of law enforcement professionals about the epidemic of theft and got robbed. So I think we know which department's next. Well, this is huge with the fuel allowance, but I mean, we got to put it into perspective. They did do an impact report today, and the report said that we're only going to lose 4,000 people. Only 4,000. Can we put that into perspective? We're only losing 4,000 people this winter today. In the 22-23 winter, the Tories lost 4,950. Okay. The year before that, excess winter deaths were 13,400, and the year before that, it was 60,760. So if anything, like Labour's making things better.
Right. So you're saying Keir Starmer is basically finishing the job that Labour started. Or am I now putting back in Wenceslas?
Come back in Wenceslas, because what's crazy to me is that he's justified this. He's justified this by saying, but they're going to get more money back in the pension reforms in next April, where we're going to raise all their pensions by about 4%, which will give everybody about £460 a year, which is more than the 200 or 300 they would have gotten from the winter fuel allowance. So it's a win. They're actually going to end up positive, and they go, hang on a second, they have to make it through winter here in order to get that. It's like the Squid Game for pensioners.
I mean, in terms of the optics of it, shivering pensioners don't always convey an overt message of hope and progress.
because I suspect that's part of it, isn't it? He doesn't mind being unpopular with people who, lost the young vote when they voted for Brexit 8 years ago. They should have been forgiven for that. He knows he doesn't really have to worry. He's got his own backbench to worry about. He doesn't have to worry about the opposition. They haven't even got any backbench. They don't even need a backbench. They've got a shooting system for deck chairs. And he's currently, he can make as many unpopular decisions as he wants at the moment because he is in that sweet spot where anything the Tories say, you go, well, I would love it if you hadn't left me with this mess, but here we are doing his kind of Oliver Hardy moment. There's going to be 2 years of obvious accusations of hypocrisy. There'll be a sweet spot of about 6 months with some meaningful debate, and then the government will be exhausted for 2 years, and then there'll be an election. We go through that. In the meantime, the opposition is bizarrely Nigel Farage.
It is weird that actually he is in the honeymoon period, and they say, well, it is fine for him because he is in the honeymoon period. I don't think anyone has ever experienced the answer to the question, how is he honeymoon? Yeah, it was good, but a lot of old people died.
People say that he's coming out with the unpopular policies first, that maybe in the autumn statement he'll do something radical, perhaps he'll be changes to capital gains tax, there might be more changes to taxes on higher earners. We don't know. He might be class tank now, and he might rip that shirt, S for Starmer, Superman. You don't know. It could happen.
He's the son of a toolmaker.
Some people have said that the government's already losing its lustre. It does raise an interesting philosophical question. Can a potato lose its shine?
I would say, Andy, I read a story about Keir Starmer that his children asked for a puppy and he negotiated with them. I think that is...
that's barely a meal, is it?
The decision could affect 10 million people, but that won't really be a problem unless the temperature drops below, say, 20, 22 degrees Celsius at any point in the next 6 to 8 months, which seems pretty unlikely.
It would be. I as a central right individual, I always find it absolutely deliciously ironic if he's made himself this unpopular and then it's a mild winter and no one dies anyway. It's the perfect.
Simon and Glenn, Keir Starmer has placed an order for the biggest what in history, Foreign Secretary. Watch the world tremble. North Korea will be terrified at the sight of a 110-metre David Lammy. Well, is that right? It's not. Well, it's a right idea, but it's not the right answer.
Rolling back privatisation.
I've got a serious one. Cheaper entertainment costs for waiting rooms. No, it'll cost £20,000. Those wooden blocks you have to push around the wire.
I think we should make GPs answer the wrong phones. Do we have any GPs in? Wow. You are a brave woman to admit that. I say we stop the show and have an appointment. Where's your receptionist now, bitch?
Thank you so much for your service. Please don't go private. We love you.
Keir Starmer has said that the NHS is like a pair of eggs in the early stages of an omelette-making competition. Broken, but not beaten. He gave The report has suggested that focus should be more on care in the community and prevention and other means to save money for the NHS, such as people watching YouTube videos of how to do a frontal lobotomy on themselves with a pizza cutter. We can all do our bit. What scored 4 points all? Moving on to another government measure. What is going to be banned by next summer? Oasis.
Rent increases?
Well, you're closer. Just being evicted for just no reason. Yes, no fault evictions. Some fault evictions will still be allowed in certain circumstances, such as when you just lost a general election. Because it's obviously housing.
Yeah.
I'll illustrate that now. Who here likes living somewhere? Spot the GP again. That's why it's such a big issue.
People do love living in their house. Yeah, that's true. So this is about the end of Section 21. That was a standard clause in rental agreements that essentially said that terminate a tenancy through no fault. This meant that tenants were scared to say anything to their landlord in case they misisused this clause.
spent much of the week since we last spoke at the Oval watching England lose to Sri Lanka in under 3.5 days. Honestly, what is the point of a sporting event that takes less than half a week? I will never understand. Listening to my fellow Test match football commentators say things like, they really shouldn't have got out like that. They just weren't in long enough. I can see why they're doing it, but I still think it's a risky approach. What else might people have been saying that about this week?
This week's torture cricket has been applied to the early release of prisoners.
Correct. Well done.
Another thing that was forced upon Keir Starmer, and so he has no room in jail, especially with the massive upsurge of Facebook felonies over the summer, and consequently they're all out popping champagne corks or possibly on gross respect of carver of the sector. Yes, some fairly infuriating scenes, and if you happen to be one of the people who was on the wrong end of the GBH, the bloke got out about 5 years early for, and so on, possibly not that amusing, but we'll see whether it works. Who knows? Prison is there for four main reasons, apparently. It's there for retribution, of course. It's nice to feel that some sort of justice has been done. It's there supposed to be as a deterrent. There's supposed to be a degree of rehabilitation, and also it just keeps people off the street where they can't offend again. And the first three of those have all proven not to work. The first three of those are all just myths. And the only thing that actually works is keeping them off the street, and that's the one they haven't done. So, it's probably time to convert the prisoners to...
And that's really the theme of the whole thing. You hear this, and it repeats over and over. So it led me to a piece called Silky M.
Silky M by the American pianist, composer and band leader Sean Mason, 2023. Emma, you're a jazz musician, does it do it for you?
It certainly does. Such a great choice. I wasn't aware of this album. I think I was aware of the fantastic horn players that are on that track. Tony Garrison on trumpet, Chris Lewis on trumpet. Absolutely incredibly groovy and amazing sound, and there's such a sense of play, and there's so much spontaneity as well. You can kind of hear the journey of the soloists and the band as a whole, and it just grooves really hard. I just think it's brilliant. So Julian, the link, stomp, groove. What do you mean by groove?
Well, anything that makes you want to shake your foot is my love.
Staying in one kind of place, you're hearing a repeated note.
Well, there's a repeated note, but it's really about it's going to inspire you to move.
Sean Mason, the big thing he said was he wanted to move away from the era that Elton John was recording. So
Escape the zeitgeist.
and now we're in 2023, is this right?
Yes, this was recorded in 2020. This is a very organization. And they're just really aware of the composition about how to draw the listeners in.
The album's called Southern King, and it's rooted in their upbringing in North Carolina.
Short upbringing.
Tell us about Sean.
Well, he's a southern young man from America. He really has something special in the music. He's very observant, very intelligent writer, can create evocative sound, put together a great band, is not insecure in his
What? That's so much fun, and it's so audacious as well. Thank you, Julian, for the jazz. Track 2 today is Silky M by Silky M himself, Sean Mason. Anna, it's over to you now for our halfway track. What have you got in store for our track number 3? And how did you get there, Mr. Mason?
The link is that North Carolina heritage. The Southern King is all about Mason looking back at the Charlotte-born musician's roots. Actually, one of my favourite contemporary artists, the cellist, singer and composer Kelsey Lou, is also from Charlotte, North Carolina. They've just scored a multi-award winning documentary film, Daughters. French singer Lena Wilson, an American blues singer performed in vaudeville with songs like "You Used to Be Your Man" but He's My Man Now. And if we continue along the roots and folk heritage of North Carolina, we get to Elizabeth Cotton, famous for finger-picking banjo and then guitar, born in 1893, whose signature tune Freight Train is credited with the rise of Seagull here in the UK. For my track choice, we're going to shake it up a bit. We're heading to Durham, North Carolina, in the 1970s. This is a woman who was shunned by much of American society for being too wild, too free, and overtly sexual. Here we go.
Oh my goodness.
They say I'm different, like the trailblazing, dynamic singer-songwriter and producer Becky Davis from 1974. I think we know this, but let's make it clear this is not the actual Becky Davis. Julian, is there enough room in this for you?
Seriously, yeah, no. Becky Davis is a really unusual person. She seems to be the definition of an artist, you know, traveling in many different directions. I know that this was one of the people that Miles Davis knew, and that she really inspired him as he was moving more into the nonviolent way, into the groove era of his artistry, and he got him really into what was happening around that time. So this is someone who is the linchpin figure in so many musical stories. Anna, tell us a bit more about Betty Davis.
So Betty Davis was born Betty Gray Mowbray in 1944. She died in February 2022. American singer, songwriter, producer, and model. She was one of the first black models to ever get on quite a few American magazines. She developed an interest in music when she was about 10 and was introduced to various blues musicians by her grandmother, Beulah Blackwell, who stayed at her farm in Louisville, North Carolina. So my link really is that rooted in that North Carolina celebrating Southern heritage. Would you say you can hear that in this track? I think so. But it's never going to be kind of boiled down to something as simple as where she comes from. I think such a huge personality and so bold. Just like the delivery of her lyrics is just absolutely outrageous. She knows exactly who she is and where she comes from, who she's been inspired from. And it's rooted in this kind of like, I'm here, this is who I am. I have this kind of raw energy and I'm not afraid to present that. This on the roster of now, I think it's just maybe she was before her time.
Thank you, Anna. This is Add to Playlist. Me, Jeffrey Ratchet.
Me, Anna Phoebe.
Our studio guests today are the pianist Julian Joseph and the saxophonist Emma Rabbit. A quick reminder of our first three tracks in today's playlist, please.
Of course, we started with Ready and the Jet by Elton John, then CPM by Sean Mason, and third we had They Say I'm Different by Betty Davis.
So, Emma, it's over to you now. You're very patient. Where are we heading to track 4, and how do we link back to the powerhouse that is Betty Davis?
It's funny, I feel that some of us have been on quite long, winding journeys like this, but this one actually occurred instantly when I heard this amazing track by Betty Davis. And I had to kind of note the fact that this little track, the Betty Davis track, is one that very much uses kind of static music in the background, very much a lot more what it is blues, it's very striking, but nevertheless it stays in one kind of tonal centre, it stays in one place with the groove, and it really just sits there and allows Betty to tell her story and present herself, tell the world who she is over the top of that, kind of using it as a backdrop or a canvas
喂
to paint with her words and tell the story.
多长时间回来？我刚刚现在去 NR2，等一下， 通常说8点钟回来啊，就是20分钟，15、20分钟。
And that led me to a fantastic recording of traditional African American work song, Walking Past, recorded by incredible artist Sam Hamilton.
Walking Boss by the American singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist Sam Amidon in 2014.
I love this advert, but what is the story tradition Paddy? Just saying it's a folk song. Yeah, so it's an African American work song. It highlights the plight of the working class and the boss and the power that he holds over the workers to kind of affect their life, basically. And it's been recorded by Sam Amidon, a fantastic folk artist, singer-songwriter. He's a really original artist, I feel, and he, for most of his first recordings, generally reimagined existing folk material, existing repertoire, but despite that, very much had his own sound and his own identity as a musician. And I just thought it was a really powerful delivery of this song, because I love Sam's voice. The track is one that I've enjoyed for a really long time, and it's in the same key as the Better Days, and it has this kind of forward concept that I guess makes it so appropriate for the work song. Definitely banjo, there's some kind of soft function. What do we think? Well, Sam's a very talented multi-instrumentalist. Banjo, plays the fiddle, plays guitar, incorporates a lot of percussion into his music, and it's kind of taking this quite simply structured folk song and creating this tapestry of different textures that create this driving groove.
And it's also interesting because it's got that, I'm getting a big criticism here, bluesy feel to it, bluesy sound, you know, because and the blues is a sound, not a scale. But one of the very poignant things about blues is it's 5 bars long. The whole is 5 bars. Incredible, 5 bars long. Most things are in sequences of 4 and 4 then 2.
I wasn't counting bars, I was just listening to that banjo and listening to the software. What's the 5 bar sequence for this?
Well, I think it creates something unexpected, and it's probably what draws you in. When Emma was talking about the backdrop, being relatively simple, it's actually simple but with a twist. And that 5 bars, because it's quite unusual, is shaking you off your, being settled or bored by it. So it's constantly just kind of, you're kind of resetting it or removing it, and it's keeping you engaged.
What I find interesting also, because I think this tells us something about his mindset, is that he didn't choose a producer who is also from that folk tradition. The producer of this album is Valdir Sigurðsson. He's an Icelandic producer who's worked with Sigur Rós, Damon Albarn, with Chronic Quartet, which I feel like is a bit of a flow from today, is that you're taking roots music and folk and reimagining it, or having fresh ears for the 21st century.
There's definitely something really fresh about this. Well, listen, Emma, thank you so much for bringing that to our playlist. Track 4 in today's episode add to playlist is Walking Boss by Sam Amidon.
So, how would you like to round off proceedings today, Jeffrey? Where are you going to take us?
One of the many things that I love about As a Playlist is how we find close cousins between styles of music that might otherwise feel far apart. Walking Boss is so evocative of the Deep South, and that's got a lot to do with banjo. Milo is instrument-based, the banjo. Knock down the trunk family tree is the child of an instrument that originates in West Africa, the three-string but, like the banjo, known as the conting. So yes, for our program today, we're going to West Africa, Senegal, to be precise, with a glorious piece of music where the traditional conting is proud front and centre. Papalay by the Senegalese band Esikolau from the project Ears of the People, a conting song from Senegal and the Gambia, released just last year. And we're right back into the groove, aren't we? I mean, straight away. Emma, we're hearing conting. That's my link.
It's great. I think it's a really beautiful instrument. It feels very kind of grounding in a way. That kind of constant presence in the track.
Absolutely. I mean,
Jeffrey. A conting is the link. Can you please explain to us what does it look like?
You know what a banjo looks like? Very similar instrument. Okay? It's three-stringed instrument. The body of the instrument is broad. It's broad and in plucky strings. There's a few bits of translation that needs to go there. Papalay itself, the title of the song, means sequential in, I believe, Senegalese. And Esikolau translates to our village. Often on As a Playlist, we like to hear from specialists to get a better understanding of different elements of the music we're discussing, and to dig a little deeper into this relatively unknown instrument, but the conting. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome the Grammy Award-winning musician, composer, and founder of the Carolina Chocolate Shops, Rhiannon Giddens. Rhiannon joins us on the line from her home in Ireland. Rhiannon, welcome to As a Playlist. How are you keeping?
I'm keeping good. Thanks for having me.
Now, thank you so much for being here. Now, many people will know your work, not least of all from Beyonce's album, Cowboy Carter, from earlier this year, and your banjo contribution in the hit single, Texas Hold'em, celebrating the black roots of country music. Rhiannon, I mean, you've got a smile on your face. Did you know it was a hit when you recorded it, be honest?
Yeah, I think that's a long story. But yeah, it's been an amazing journey to see people all over the world posting the dance TikToks to that song and having my banjo be in there. It's been pretty amazing.
It's the first thing you hear on the song. I mean, that is special. How important is banjo in that particular song? You're talking about the heritage, the link to the country, what Beyonce was trying to achieve with that project.
I mean, I think, leading with the banjo, not just any banjo. I play a banjo, a replica of banjo from, the 1850s, and it's a moment where the banjo is very much still rooted in the deeper sound of its African forebears, and it was a time where everybody knew that the banjo was a black instrument. So not just having a banjo, but particularly my banjo, I think was it was I'm sending a message.
Okay. Tell us more about your banjo, because the things that I've made is about the instrument. When you say banjo, 19th century, what does it look like? What does it sound like? What's its recent history?
Well, the recent history we know, of course, everybody knows the banjo is a bluegrass instrument. Everybody knows the sound, you know, where it's, you know, much higher, it's got more of a tinny sound, it's got metal strings, but really a large part of the banjo's history from its origins as an Afro-Diaspora ceremonial instrument in the Caribbean in the early 1700s to being, you know, accompanying people moving up into the United States as an instrument that then turns into, you know, more of a dance instrument, starts crossing over to white culture, it starts being used in different ways, you know, but for a large part of that history, it was a wooden instrument, it would have been made out of boards, would have been made, you know, from gut strings, and so up until the 1860s and 70s, really, the deep sound was really what people knew of as banjo, and so many of the rhythmical patterns that come from so many different types of African music are still really kind of present and inherent in the music that was played on these instruments. One of the reasons why we don't know about this period of the banjo is because this was the style of banjo that was used for blackface minstrelsy. Okay. So it kind of puts a damper on looking back at it, but for me it's a very important time period because it is some of the earliest transcriptions of banjo music we have. You know, it's from that time, so you have to go digging in the dirt, I'm afraid.
We're moving further back in history. Let's go back to the conte, which is an instrument that many listeners might have never heard of before. I know you know it well. Talk us through what is conte and how did it evolve into what you're carrying out?
Well, these things in their head that then comes out, you know, and then finds its way around, combines with European music in the Caribbean and in both North and South America. So for me, that was another connection of like how did the African music get descended to us in the New World.
It feels like your 1850s instrument is the missing link between the previous track, which was Walking Boss, Sam Hammond, which is a banjo bluegrass kind of sound, and this accompaniment. I would love to hear just a little bit more of you playing your banjo because it's such a distinctly different sound which really links the two together.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly, and that's why I've been such an advocate for this instrument and this period of history which has been sort of, you know, neglected. And it's supposed, just because of the negativity that I think specifically on music that they were playing is coming from the earliest folk music of America, and so we don't want to lose that. You can very much hear the connection in this banjo, much easier than you can in modern banjo.
Yeah, and you hear those gut strings. It's missing those kind of mid-high frequencies, isn't it, of this real
It's a very warm sound, yeah.
It's a beautiful sound. I feel so
This is a conversation we can continue. Rhiannon, thank you so much. Altogether Stages, thank you so much for joining us on the show with your banjos. Tell Beyonce to say hello. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being with us, Davis.
Thank you so much for having me and for highlighting the accounting. It's beautiful.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Our final track today, Bakalay by Esther Hello. Thank you so much to our studio guests and the shiny piano, the fabulous, I say, Julian Joseph.
And thanks too to the one and only saxophonist extraordinaire, Emma Rabbit.
And of course, thank you to our special guest, Rhiannon Giddens on banjo.
And thank you for listening. Please don't forget that all previous episodes of Active are available to stream or download via BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jeffrey Whitey.
And I'm Anna Phoebe.
Do join us next time for another 5-track roller coaster adventure. But in the meantime, Julie and Emma, would you play us out with what we can do to adventure? You want to do?
Why not?
was so difficult.
After Playlist was produced by Jerome Weatherald and presented with music direction by Jeff Guache. After the news, the leader of the Alba Party, Alex Salmon, was on the panel with Baroness Goldie, Ivan McKee and Michael Shanks. Any questions?
Uplifting stories of courage, compassion and kindness.
There's so many people who have no normal life, everyone was helping. She was going to write the letter to Chip, yeah. And then that made she want to help more when you see it.
I'm Rachel Byrne, and each week in Cafe Home, I'll be chatting to people on a mission to transform the lives of others.
I think I always wanted to live my life with a purpose.
Hearing about their experiences.
I think, oh, don't go there.
The new series of Cafe Home on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds, starting this Monday morning at 9:45.
So Keir Starmer and President Biden are about to meet in Washington to discuss allowing Ukraine to use weapons provided by the West to attack Russian territory. The UK has given long-range missiles to Kyiv, but they're currently only allowed to be used within Ukraine. Putin has warned against lifting the restrictions, saying it will represent NATO's direct participation in Ukraine's war. Former CIA Director General David Petraeus says Mr. Putin is bluffing.
I think he has established innumerable red lines before. The Ukrainians and or Western countries have crossed just about all of them. He's even rattled the nuclear saber, and so much so that his own biggest ally and partner, China, said, don't even think about that. I don't think there's anything more conventionally do that he's not already doing.
A woman has been found not guilty of a racially aggravated public order offence after being photographed at a pro-Palestinian protest with a placard that depicted the then Prime Minister and then Secretary, Sunak and Braverman, as hooligans. The phrase is used to accuse people from ethnic minorities of acting like white people. Westminster Magistrates Court says Maruha Hussein's placard was part of the genre of political satire. The BBC television presenter Jay Blades has appeared before magistrates charged with controlling or coercive behaviour. Court documents say the charge relates to his wife. The Northern Ireland Secretary Hilary Benn says the UK government will not be funding the redevelopment of Eastern Park Stadium in Belfast. In a letter, Mr Benn said the cost of the project had risen to £400 million. Eastern Park is being expected to host football matches as part of Euro 2028. And the singer Justin Timberlake has reached a plea deal to bring his driving case in the US to an end. The pop star, who was originally charged with driving while intoxicated, pleaded guilty to the less serious traffic offence of driving while impaired. He's been ordered to perform 25 hours of community service. BBC News. In an hour's time, we've got a new series of the programme exploring the ideas that shape our lives. Free thinking. With the party conference season coming up tonight, they're exploring liberal government authoritarianism on the books of the German thinker Carl Schmitt. That's at 9. And political discussion now on Radio 4. It's time for Any Questions with Alex Forsyth.
Hello and welcome to Glasgow, Scotland's largest city. It needs little introduction. We are in the Finneton district on the north bank of the River Clyde. We are high up on the 8th floor of Sky Park, a business campus that's home to everything from startups to space companies. And from our venue, there are incredible panoramic views over the city, stretching across to the university campus in Kelvin Grove on one side and the Ibrox Stadium on the other. Joining me here is Ivan McKee, Public Finance Minister in the Scottish Government, and the SNP MSP for Glasgow Province. Before politics, Ivan worked in manufacturing for 30 years and was a member of Business for Scotland, a group of business people who campaigned for Scottish independence during the 2014 referendum. Michael Shanks is the Energy Minister and the Labour MP for Rutherglen. He was first elected to Westminster at a by-election in October last year, and he was swiftly given a ministerial role following the general election in July. During the COVID lockdown, Michael started running along every one of Glasgow's 6,143 streets, and when he completed his challenge in January 2022, he'd run a total of almost 1,500 miles. Michael, is that one of those challenges you
good Russian starting?
There definitely was, but I got too far into the storm.
There we are. Well, congratulations. Alex Salmond is the leader of the Alba Party and a former First Minister of Scotland. He got involved with the SNP for Sweden and went on to represent the party as an MP, MSP, leader and First Minister before he resigned after the independence referendum, which was almost exactly 10 years ago. In 2021, he announced he was forming the new political party, which he now leads. And Baroness Annabel Goldie was made a Conservative peer in 2013 and served as a defence minister in government 3 months. News about Green transport comes as a surprise to anybody. There have been warnings about this for some time, and yet it wasn't until the closure was announced that the government announced what they were going to do to try and then open an industrial replacement. It's just too late.
I don't think that's quite right. I think we announced within weeks of coming to power that we were going to fund the Scottish Project Global, which is a 1.5 billion investment to fight an industrial future for the site.
That's years old. That's not going to happen.
But I think that's what's important to say is that could have been done years ago. And the Scottish Government, to be fair, had worked very well with us and was ready to fund that site years ago. We would have meant that there was a transition. I think we didn't get to so that project didn't go forward. We've done that with the Greeks and coming to power. You're right, there will be a gap in that extremely unfortunate, which is why in the short term I think it's going to have to go to work now. But in the long term we want to ensure there is an industrial future on that site.
Okay, so Petro Ineos, of course, behind the Great Mount refinery, has made the point that they were losing somewhere in the region of about $500 million at one point. So this wasn't sustainable. Alex Salmond?
Well, there must be about a figure like unions that most companies say that finally could make $80,000 a day, which was done properly, and particularly the investment, for example, the hydrocracker was made, which would make the plant more efficient. But look at the fundamentals of this. The fundamentals are the top 25 oil producers in the world. There's a single one who doesn't have a refinery to refine their product. Scotland would become the only one of the top 25 who doesn't have a refinery. But as long as you're producing oil and gas, it makes economic sense, it makes environmental sense to refine your own product. So you've got to ask yourself, why is every other country of the top 25 managing to do this, but apparently not in Scotland? So that's all this stuff about all the can't do everything, we can't do this, we can't do that. It's all nonsense. The government's documents are substantial. This government, with Nike representatives, say to the oil companies that are significant granting any of this, I'm not sure if they are, but if they are, say we're granting a license on condition that we refine most of the product.
Great Mount doesn't currently refine all the oil and gas.
Yes, it does. It doesn't refine all the oil, but split refining is a substantial part. But that would be a condition of the license where appropriate in terms of the product you want to refine. There's no justification you have in place. Well, environmentally, it doesn't make any sense at all. Take crude oil and export it by tanker and then re-import the refined product. Rangers has seen the pipelines going into it. And they say, we bought this pipeline, there was a Canadian pipeline that's much the most efficiently environmentally transport oil and petroleum products. So there's an environmental justification as well as an economic justification. And then we're demonstrating that it really is not a consolation. With 400, 500 people about to lose their jobs in Grangemouth to say at some point in the indeterminate future, you might well get a job in renewable energy. That's what's going to act in Scotland towards self-sufficiency in renewable energy. But I never believed that I was doing that so she could abandon oil jobs and say we're not going to have the benefits of oil and gas so that we can have renewables. It's not an either or, it's meant to be both. And it certainly is not satisfactory to say that there's nothing to be done. Every other country of the top 25 oil and gas producers in the world that insist on their product being refined in their country. And so she's not.
Just a point of clarification, I said the plant was losing $500 million, $500,000 a day is what they said. Ivan McKee.
Well, first of all, just recognise the difficult time it is for the workers at Grangemouth. It's never easy to find yourself in that situation, and Grangemouth, by the way, person who does the rain, the again who does 2013. know, a lot of people say that Jim Ratcliffe, the head of Ineos, the investment in Manchester United, you know, is a social global. I don't think it's that at all. I mean, if you didn't have a heart, you wouldn't be investing in Manchester United for a start. But when the UK government's currently offering Ineos a loan guarantee of £600 million to develop a plant in Antwerp, right? £600 million to develop a plant in Antwerp. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of government to say, Mr. Ratcliffe, very, very good businessman, incidentally, to see that £600 million loan guarantee in Antwerp, you don't get that unless you secure £30 million to build a hydrocracker in the Grangemouth mine.
Okay.
What's so difficult about doing that?
Okay, Michael King.
Well, the first thing to say is that the acquisition made under a previous government is for a very different purpose. But the other thing is that Alex on a number of occasions tonight has said we can do this or insist on a private company doing this. There is a limit to what as a government insist a private company does. What we have tried throughout this process is to encourage, to persuade, both where we can, Petro that the government doesn't own Grangemouth as a refinery. What we have to do now is try and find a sustainable long-term future of the site. And my worry is Alex references you via attempts at sales to the refinery. What we need to do, we'll work with them. We're not working with them. Because we're right back where we started now. And this is still here. Well, what makes you compare with the course of the I said I don't want the
Just briefly.
The way we structure is sustainable. So work was there. That point has to be what what is that what is something that is sustainable and justified by a lot of laws.
Okay, thank you both. Annabelle Golding, thank you for your patience. Your take.
Yeah, well, I've listened with interest, as I'm sure the audience and the listeners have as well, and I found enough to tell two things that actually really done participate, and it's quite naive to pretend that it was an art, unexpected perhaps, system for finding but it's not. What I think above all else, all of what this convention is what honesty and kindness actually want to do one argument. And we can't go flying kites and we can't go raising expectations without knowing what the actual facts are. I'm encouraged to hear that the Westminster government and the Scottish government are in conversation, but I would like to see that broadened out to the whole, which includes the union, which includes the company itself, and that is then a candid discussion about what is actually possible for this plan. I'm not an expert, I don't know. I'm told the plan is old, I'm told the plan is a massive amount of investment, I'm told there's a lot of money spent on complying with the law. Now, that's a case, it's a case of plans. What my view is, that I've asked the company in conjunction with the to raise a figure particularly months in and business, get that and see what we can have out so that everybody actually can understand what is possible. Sadly, what might be
Thank you all very much indeed, and thank you, John, for your question. Before we move on, I want to remind you that you can mail anything we discuss during the course of the programme. If you want to do that, you need to phone any answers. The number is 03700 100 444 9 at 12:30 p.m. on a Saturday. You can also send a WhatsApp message to that number right now to the phone. And here we go. On to our next piece coming from Douglas Smith.
Labour Government have been to Scottish Government that they're spending £150 million on residents and taxpayers.
Douglas, thank you for your question. So, of course, the winter fuel payment needs tested in Westminster, and the Scottish Government also announced that it's going to then be needs tested in Scotland as well. Ivan McLean.
Well, in terms of recent times, these up to like basis of other places.
But it has cost money.
Well, absolutely. I think choose to spend more money. There were arrangements to help support the regional farmers at the time. We'll recognise the challenges that the cost of living crisis has brought to members of society, and so that was the reason for that. You can argue that that money could have should be used for something different. The situation with the winter fuel allowance, of course, is that was due to be devolved for this winter. Immediately before that, of course, the government, the Labour government announced that we were that, even as a possession, that they didn't have the money to put into build up all the utilities. So last night, unfortunately, had to follow through and see the next one in Scotland. But in terms of the broader budget process, folks making money out of it, well, definitely more than Scotland in terms of social contract. Yes, that's the reason we get a bit more use for that tuition, university, restrictions, university elderly, for the groundbreaking child payment, children, support with that, support with those IT families that cost us to get for school, and the public sector workers, considering more of the
Right, and because you made those choices around welfare and social security and public sector pay and council tax, that does mean you have also made the choice about the particular allowance. Because actually, it didn't mean just because Westminster took a decision, you had to take a decision for Scotland. You choose how to spend it.
The expectation
that choice.
The expectation was that that money would go to it. And if it was a decision of £50,000 a year ago, made it currently working very hard to get out to all of those
Well, I'd like to view payment across the board. There's no doubt at all
significant gap in what the tax rate brings in and what we spend on government. What we didn't do, that underneath the surface was 22 billion a year spending that wasn't predictable. We couldn't have known about it until we get into the markets. You don't know what they have promised to spend money on without telling the House of Commons what they're going to spend it on. And Annabelle rightly points out public sector pay. She might not want to, or her party might not want to pay public sector workers what they're due, but there has to be some pay sector public sector workers. Not a single penny is put aside for public sector pay. Like it's not a penny. Now they might not spend £90 million. We're going to have to spend something on the public sector people, and we chose not to make any allowance for that. This is just one of a number of examples of the mess we had to tidy up in the last 2 months. Now that doesn't make this decision any easier. There are two things I think are important to bring up to details. First of all, it is one of the most untargeted benefits of the government government pays. Now the difference in pensions is it is difficult to analyse income from pensioners, which knows that income from. That's why we said we didn't get pension credit.
Right, but you know the reality the way you are doing is and actually there are alternatives you could look at to mitigate it threshold where some people on very low incomes that might not be on pension credit will now miss out.
Well, and that's why we said, for example, we jumped off £400 more in the pension this year, £1,700 more in the pension by the end of this Parliament, which is a significant increase in pension. But the reality is, when times are tough, and just to bring it back to the question, the Scottish Government is realising now that actually to govern is to choose, and they're going to have to make some tough decisions. They haven't done that for the past 17 years, which is why they're in the mess that they're in. But the reality is that when you've got a significant number of people who need public services that older people rely on, particularly the NHS, it's important that we get our economy and our public finances back into the state where our public services can run properly.
What a ridiculous thing to say, Michael. You should know that for every one of the years that we've been in government, we have balanced the budget. We have balanced the budget every single year.
But balancing the budget doesn't mean you make good choices.
We've made choices.
You might not disagree with them, but it looks like these are the same thing in 2017. And they estimated that 4,000 additional deaths would occur if that payment was withdrawn. That was the Labour Party's estimate in 2017. Now I suspect the same estimate will apply now. So people have made a decision, presumably on the knowledge that this is going to cause a potential 4,000 deaths coming with them in this pension. And that according to these conservatives, they expect to balance that trust more than any 2 million people have been severely disadvantaged. That's an extraordinary choice to make, and an extraordinarily difficult thing to decide.
Let me ask you then, you've made the point that this is about political choices. What would you choose not to do to fund the legislative allowance? Is that public sector pay deal? Is that tax free? Is that universal free prescriptions?
Right.
What is it?
Okay, I'm sacking government by thinking that really there's no economic subsidy. And have interest rates reduced by around 2%. There's no economic reasons why there shouldn't be at 3% as opposed to 5%. That would save the government approximately £20 billion in not paying interest payments to the financial sector, which coincidentally and very happily is the sort that would stop the momentum, which is trying to save by causing extra deaths on pensions.
Just ever so briefly, I want to give the opportunity to Michael Shanks to come back on the point that Alex Salmon made about the potential impact on different institutions and the impact assessment of the potential consequences.
Well, firstly, at Alex's point, of course, this isn't something we want to do. No government would want to make these kind of choices, but we have had to make very different choices, and more difficult choices to come, because we have got to find the money to do £22 billion back. Annabelle says no evidence before it's coming in, we need to get in the independent analysis of the improvements there, and indeed there's now an inquiry going on into the previous government about how they introduced these costs in here. So this is a serious problem. And look, I'm not suggesting for a second this is a choice that we want to make, but it's forced to make. It's one we've been forced to make by the economic mess we're inheriting. And secondly, the Labour Party stick with their estimate that such a move is going to cause 4,000 excess deaths
non-pensioners this winter. That was your estimate in 2017. Keir Starmer signed up to it. Is that still your estimate?
No, and what we've done in the interim around this is more than a third of people who are entitled to pension credit won't claim it. We're going to turn that around for the people who are entitled to money to get that money. And also the triple lock has led to a significant increase in pensions. And I think if you look at over the last 5 years, because of inflation, pensions have risen considerably. And that's the point.
Yeah, I was going to add to the list of what else we could do. The UK Labour government has taken its ridiculous position on the disaster that's been Brexit, take us back into the European Union in January, where the economy let businesses grow and export into that large market. That has been estimated as adding more to the value of the country than the twice what we talked about this in a black hole. That's something we can recognise.
Thank you all very much. Before we move on, I want to let you know that next week we will be at Weavers Academy in Wellingborough. We've still got some tickets available for that programme, so if you'd like to come along, be in the audience, put your questions to the panel. We would love to see you there. If you go to the Any Questions website, you can find all of the details right at the front. Come from Iona Bonfrey. Hello, Iona.
What are the chances of there being a second referendum in Scotland after the change?
Iona, thank you. We are approaching next week the 10th anniversary, 10 years since the Scottish independence referendum. What are the chances of there being a second? Annabelle Gordon.
Well, I think these elements of the audience, but very slim, I hope, because I remember the last occasion we did this in 2014, and I have to say I remember it for two reasons. My overwhelming sense when I got the result, and my absolute sense of confidence in Scottish voters who had listened to the arguments and understood them. But the second thing I remember was action. That's split families, it's split communities, it's split workplaces. And these movements were neither swift nor easy. It was not pleasant. I was very pleased with the result, but the one thing I'm very clear, the main arguments for saving people in 2014 not to stay in the communities from the three party that's society. These arguments are actually persuasive. So I would not want to see that happen. I want to see the Scottish Government concentrate on its essential public services that we all depend on, three of which have got a crisis that they are covering: health, education, and criminal justice system.
And yet, of course, we know from the polls that in terms of support for independence, it still broadly sits at around 50%. So you effectively say it's half the population is Scottish. Your views on that just don't matter. They're not going to get enough.
I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that there are problems in Scotland, indeed 60 problems, where very public services, where the highest tax are compared to other areas of markets in Scotland, over £2,000 in the population is spent more than the counterparts of England. And the question we're all asking is, what are we getting for the money? What's happened to these public services? What is Scotland doing? Education has been pushed into parts of it. We're no longer in top international education. Very recently, we saw the criminal justice defence lawyers leaving professional roles. They're leaving that criminal justice work. That's the way it is, causing justice. There's so much else we could be getting right in Scotland. The powers of law without starting to worry about other justice powers at this point.
Alex Salmon, what about that? Public sector services should take priority over independence.
Which is one of the arguments for Scottish independence, because public services are suffering disasters in Scotland. Union. I'm a radical independent, but what a lot of that. I think Annabelle's confusing the Scottish referendum with an 85% turnout, a huge democratic experiment, like which we've never seen in Scotland, with the Brexit referendum, which was indeed a depressing experience.
this whole last election saw 6 episodes, goodness, that's because Scotland couldn't union. Has Scotland hit the union? But I think the question was, do you think Scotland should break away from the United Kingdom and drift up towards the North Pole? Yes or no? So the question that I kind of can answer is when we started the referendum campaign in 2012, what about the benefits of 28%? I remember exactly what that every day. So I said, have a referendum and support the independence of 28%. But then again, some of the referendum was independence of 50%. I think we all know the answer. And that's why we've come down Democratic mandate after another referendum since the 2015. The question on it was, do I think the referendum should be complete or not? And therefore, I think those who are for independence have to be another Democratic party. They have to be for an election. Not in the second question, in the Scottish elections. Right? And you have to move for a majority. Not for a majority of the seats. You have to decide.
But we have just had an election. We've just had the 2024 election, and the pro-independence party, the SNP, lost 39 seats in Scotland, and your party, Alliver Party, stood 19 candidates and got fewer than 12,000 votes.
Well, we only stood 19 candidates, but the key election...
Still got fewer than 12,000 votes on an unashamedly pro-independence platform.
Yes, certainly the SNP not arguing in that election. But this is a mandate for independence, so that's the basis.
Not on that day, but you...
The second question is about the election in 2027. Well, the first question is the status of the that has to be declared before. You can't do it after. Something like nobody's wills. But if you have a mandate, you would be the first country to declare independence for an election. In Europe, that's been done by the Czech Republic and Slovakia, for example, in memory. And if you're trying to put it in a democratic way to have a referendum to exercise your self-determination for a referendum, then it's perfectly reasonable for the Scottish people under current circumstances to say we'll take the electoral test even Westminster can remove, and that has to be an election for the Scottish Parliament to see if the independence party between them can get a majority of the vote. That's what I think we should do.
Ivan McKee.
Well, first of all, in terms of point about mandate, you can't say that we didn't have the lost seats in the last general election this year, and that means it's all forever. We got a mandate in 2015 in the UK election, we got a mandate in 2016 in the Scottish election, we got a
I'm not saying
mandate in 2017 in the UK election,
what that
we
tells
got a
you
mandate
about.
in 2019
I'm
in
asking
the
you what that
UK
tells you
election, we got a
about
mandate in 2021 in the
Forgive
Scottish
me.
election, so it's 5 mandates we've had, all ignored by the UK
Forgive me.
government.
John Swinney, when he took over as First Minister, confirmed that the SNP's strategy for independence would be based on winning a majority of seats at the general election. So I'm asking what that says when you lost 39.
Well, what it says is we had 5 mandates in a row, all of them ignored by the UK government. Of course, we continue to campaign for independence, and we work to make sure that we can convince the majority of people that that is the best interest of the future of Scotland, and I firmly believe it is. You just need to look at a very successful Nordic and other European neighbours, small countries with far less natural resource opportunities than Scotland, and less human capital in Scotland in terms of the skills base, that do much, much better because they're able to make those economic and social choices for themselves. That absolutely is the future of Scotland. In terms of how we get there, yes, we need to campaign for that. We need to continue to make the case that the answer, as Alex rightly said, to many of the challenges we've got. We've got government policy still reserved. We talk about poverty and social security policy largely still reserved. We talk about the inability to borrow properly in the market, as well as fund infrastructure and other investment in Scotland's economy, all reserved. We don't have those powers. The reason we don't have those powers is what's holding Scotland back. In the meantime, we absolutely need to continue to deliver public services to the high standard that we can in Scotland, and that is one way of trying to convince people to support independence. But we're at close to 50%. There should be another referendum soon because of that exactly enough now as well. But people used to be able to say, in Northern Ireland, they've got it written and you can have a vote every 7 years. So what's different from Scotland?
Michael, thanks. On that point, you know, when there is clearly 50%, regardless of people, according to, I think if you take a sort of average of the polls over a period of time, still support independence. So what will it take for the UK government to consider a second referendum? Is there a metric? Is there a point that has to be reached?
I think the important thing about taking an average poll is independence, with the exception of the never been above half. The other one that supports it is you ask people how it goes towards having another referendum. It's gone further and further and further down the list of priorities. It's not surprising because in the decades since that referendum, what we had in Scotland, instead of a government getting on with provisions of the delays, we had distraction. The Constitution always needs to be used. And the problem is we do somehow move beyond this idea of the Constitution as the only kind of shield you can put up whenever you have to defend rising waiting lists in the NHS or poorer education standards or whatever it will be, drug deaths out of control again this year. It's always the Constitution that's the fallback for the SNP, because for the SNP, and this is where Labour versus the party, I understand, but that's always their one answer to everything, good things and bad things. I think for us, we said in this election that it's time for us to move past these kind of labels of being a yes or a no. We all want Scotland to flourish, we all want change in this country, and I firmly believe Scotland's best days lie ahead, but in order for that to happen, we have to get out of this way of thinking. And the only way we can improve our public services, the only way we can improve the fabric of our country is by debating the Constitution. It's a useful excuse for both the Conservatives and the SNP actually. Meanwhile, what we said in this election is we don't care whether you vote yes or no, we don't care if we just disagree about the end point for Scotland. The next stage of the journey, by 2026 election, has to be about fixing this country and getting on with the
Alexander, ever so briefly.
Michael, the unionist is entitled to evolutionists. I want a case of devolutionists, but I remember the coalition with the Conservative Party 10 years ago. That was the unionist coalition. He's entitled to his position. But, you know, I can't conceive that an independent Scotland, under any political leadership, land of energy plenty, without pensioners dying from fuel poverty. How could you possibly accept in a land of energy plenty there are people suffering from fuel poverty? No independent Scotland, Labour,
Any questions came from the Sky Park in Glasgow. Presenters Alex Forsyth of the Service Robin Marco, BBC Audio Visual Production. Megan Nolan reflects on changing attitudes in Ireland to having children in the point of view in a moment after the day. Tomorrow morning on Radio 4. Here's Nicky Bing.
On tomorrow morning, Saturday Live, Chris Stevens and I will be talking to culinary maestro Rita Otterman, the man who's transformed the way we think about vegetables. We welcome Liv she'll be sharing her story about the grief she felt at losing an eye to cancer, and historian siblings David and Lincoln They've written most her book and will be sharing some of their own life stories. All that, plus all that inheritance classic comedian and creator of Big 11 and Francis. If you want to be in touch with us, email SaturdayLive@bbc.co.uk and join us tomorrow morning just after 9.
Now, a point of view, a personal essay from a leading writer. Here's Megan Nolan.
Are prompted by society to advocate their way of life as a superior option, or the more difficult slog, and to therefore hold some resentment for the other camp. I refuse to do this, not only because I don't have the energy to make a whole new group of friends solely consisting of free-living spinsters, but also because I don't actually with them today. I love the babies. The babies, after all. Just because I don't want my own, doesn't mean that I don't want to hold them and see how profound and weird they are. I went to the playground with my friend Arthur's kid Theo lately, and made the mistake of encouraging me laughing at his performance of fake vomiting water, until he went up to another toddler and fake vomited his water right onto her. You can tell him to stop, but you can't really be angry with him. I love being around that age, understanding the inherent nature of the wild creature before you and accepting it. As an unmarried person who lives alone, it's so easy to get stuck in personal routine to the degree that it's then unnatural to adapt to the idiosyncrasies of others. Spending time with babies and children is a good corrective to that solipsism. It's also been an interesting time to consider the different lives my mother and I had at the same age. My mother was 26 by the time she had me, the youngest of her 3 children. She had gone more or less straight from adolescence into motherhood at 19, and she would be beyond 50 by the time she could really stop worrying about any of us. I kindly dragged out the worrying for a bonus 5 years after I left home, by dropping out of university and being a disastrous mess. The Ireland in which she had her children, and the Ireland in which I did not, and will not, are almost unrecognisably different. She was a part of that change. She took part in the contraceptive train protest, where women travelled from Dublin to Belfast and came back laden with contraceptives, then illegal in the Republic. She campaigned for the right to abortion across decades, until the repeal of the 8th Amendment in 2018. She campaigned for the legalisation of divorce, which astonishingly only became law in 1996. She grew up in an island only just beginning to strain out of its bondage to the church. And I grew up in one still reeling from its recent freedom, deciding how exactly to define itself. I wonder sometimes if this may account for a certain agitated restlessness I've always experienced in my home country, which I felt relieved to shed when I moved away. Could it be that our generation lacked both the grounding totality of submission to the Catholic Church, but also the invigorating responsibility of the task of dismantling? I always think of the 1990s there as a peculiarly formless era, shifted dramatically out of one thing, and not yet having settled into the shape of another. There were changes which must have felt stunning to the likes of my grandmother, who came of age in a time when unwed mothers and their children were routinely institutionalized. By the time I was born to my unwed parents, it was barely remarkable. Once I asked my father what his own father's reaction was in the 80s and 90s to the fact that several of his children had babies out of wedlock. He had the same reaction he had to everything my dad told me. He went, huh? In a tone of exasperated but benevolent acceptance. He was a kind of Buddhist in his way. My mother was a beautiful young woman, and not just that, but captivating and charismatic and one of life's classic free spirits. She was also a brilliant mother. But there was no way to spend her youth raising us, not partially resenting all the constraints we
Ukraine. It was expected that the product allowed Kyiv to use long-range weapons inside Russia. President Putin has warned against something. Our political editor, Chris Mason, is in the country. He says that there are two main views of Ukraine's allies.
Britain has taken a pretty kind of forward-facing position in the diplomatic language. In other words, they are broadly quite keen on this idea, but there is scepticism here in Washington, not least in the White House, because of that concern around escalation. There may never be a formal announcement, even if there is a decision to deploy these missiles. The person might know of that is when they are actually used.
Senior presenter Ted Rhodes has been charged with controlling or coercing behaviour to Putin's wife. He appeared at the limits of magistrates court this morning and has been held for a in October. Mr. Rhodes was last appear on Putin's show The Commercial on Wednesday. Two NASA astronauts, Starship, International Space Station, have given a press conference saying that they're planning to vote in the US election for the space. Sue Williams and Kevin Gilmore were on an independent mission that brings the Second Space Station up to months, as there's no need to bring code into the missions. The UK government says that it will not be funding the redevelopment of the Eastern Park Stadium in Belfast, which is expected to cost €90 million in 2028. Northern Ireland Secretary for the weekend said the cost had risen to £400 million. A teacher who carried a placard at a pro-Palestinian protest depicting Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman as coconuts has been found not guilty of a racially aggravated public order offence. The 87-year-old Khalifa Hussein's defence said that the placard was not racist but satirical. And the funeral of the former England manager Sven-Göran Eriksson has taken place. David Beckham was one of 600 members of service this week. BBC News.
We now know how Taylor Swift is casting her vote in the US elections, but how much difference is that going to make to the result? BBC's Justin Webb, Sarah Smith and Mariana Spring will be discussing that question in this week's edition of Americast at 11 tonight.
tonight here on Radio 4. Now it's time for Free Thinking.
Hello, I'm Anne Nicole Roy, and this is Free Thinking, the programme where we look to the history of ideas to cast a light on the week's news agenda, and maybe vice versa. Think of us as trying to keep in the commentary pages of a newspaper or website as written by some of the great thinkers of the past. So if you've ever wondered what Thomas Hobbes would have to say about policing, or Immanuel Kant on junk food, or how Tacitus would fare as a political sketch writer, then you come to the right place.
Based on where you question it. Well, news wasn't enough. You said long before that. I mean, Schmidt
did have the advantage of knocking around.
And Schmidt was, and he was a genuine apologist for the regime, for Lebensraum, all of that. He was a racist, he was an anti-Semite. I think we should be very wary of Schmidt. But what's so interesting about Schmidt is that at certain moments is a pure grit. It just, it's not a permanent thing, it comes and goes. But post 9/11 was one, and now is another. He's fashionable again. And I think it's a warning sign rather than evidence of what he is to us.
Katja. So you yeah, I was just saying.
People have to feel they have access to that power. But I think people are increasingly frustrated by elections as the way to access that power. And we should think harder about the different ways to do it, not just referendum. There's a whole panoply of ways to do it out there. And we don't ever explore them.
Do you think it's relevant to referendum? The contest of ideas, personalities there for the leadership. Number of David's point, it's not really about the election. We do tend to, in our system and in the media recording, raise up elections because they're kind of proof that democracy is happening. But there are many other ways in which democracies have to establish or sustain itself. But Marshall has got anything to say to it.
I think the let's not even the
I would be surprised, for instance, if Penny Baker wasn't welcome, because I think she's very interested in issues of political thought. I don't mean to say bedside reading as in a manual.
Sure.
Running on the Schmidt ticket is probably not what you want to do. But you know, I certainly don't mean that. But I just mean as the way.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we have some ideas in the party around, roughly speaking, is it a sort of centrist or conservative? Patriotic view orientated to the right view. I actually think the fundamental divide is one of competence and integrity. I think that's what it's lost.
This is Free Thinking. I'm Nicole Roy, and I'm discussing whether we're living through a crisis of democracy with the help of the German political theorist Paul Schmidt. Tonight's studio guest, Charles Schmidt, Constantine, University and Now, autumn in the publishing industry is when shortlists are announced thick and fast for many prizes. In non-fiction publishing, this is boom time with larger sales and audiences at festivals wanting to learn about a full range of subjects. So over the coming weeks here on Free Thinking, we'll be spotlighting titles in different ways. And we'll start tonight with a prize run by the British Academy, which is the UK's National Academy of Humanities and Social Sciences. They also run a prize for books which promote global cultural understanding. So before we talk about what that might mean, Charles Tripp, you said that you are Professor Emeritus of Politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University. Long title, SOAS, as more commonly referred to. You're also chair of the judges this year, and earlier this year you announced your shortlist. And because we like to give our panel of guests program tasks, each of them has, and they're looking at them rather with some anxiety in some quarters, have a prop or an image in front of them. Now, Tom, we're going to start with you and what you've got written on it. We're keeping Charles in suspense here about what's going to happen. What have you got in front of you?
I have a Spanish phrase book and an Italian phrase book, actually both published by the BBC.
Because they're doing that cross-promotion thing again. And why is that?
I have almost just 4% of the world's population, 96% of the world's 7,000
this comes from the language that is quite preserved and English mother tongue by us Highland. And I don't expect it to be Italian, Spanish or our dictionaries here that we're reading about in this book and other videos.
Yes, extraordinary book, which gives a very moving picture of
desperate to show the binoculars and microscopes into which war and tremendous troops when war began. But the most remarkable thing was not the request, but the fact that the Germans said yes. Why? Because they needed rubber, and we controlled most of the world's supply. So they traded each other binoculars and rubber, the better to pull each other with. A reminder too about how much these seemingly simple things matter in the event of war. And I wait for the explanation how they have learned to talk. Yes, so that's why we have Charles now. How does salt link Ecuador forward from the study to a world? A substantial story about past 50 decades. Charles.
So, salt is one of the chapters in this book on deals with a number of iron, salt, sand, and how they use salt, and therefore what the consequences were. In fact, the story about the Zeiss binoculars comes out of the chapter on sand, where it was discovered that maybe last members of the Zeiss was particularly good there. But the salt is really interesting because one of the things that he discovered, of course, is that while people may not want glass, they have to have salt. And of course, very early on, nuclear power decided that that was something people like to control them. So one of the things he's done is to show that in the 13-dynasty-long history of China, one institution survived, and that was the monopoly of salt.
We're going to have to erase all of it. Actually, you can send it in a sentence. What clues does it give us?
Slightly baffled and very long-sighted.
Well, that was a good one.
Yeah. So I have sort of four questions. Three of animals. So I've got cows, swans, high bars. Another one is sort of a call it idyll. We've got sheep and lambs in pasture, and then a group of hens. And the fourth picture is a real looking map, and with America, which is the bottom, but it also says mother, northern, and it's also north and south.
John's just going to help you out here, because this is a book called Animals, but it's catchy. But you can figure out which sheep from the cows and goats.
Do you want my sentence? The reason indigenous people lack animal agriculture relates to their revulsion at the idea of eating someone they fed.
Exactly, and that's turned, if you like, the Spanish notions of how you should cultivate the land and the things on it, and of course what you should eat on its head. And as a result of the balance of power, the Spaniards then regard everything that indigenous people do as uncivilized. But interestingly, that's to the way we think. In other words, we think that domestication of animals is the highest form of civilization. I think one of the things demonstrates very quickly is that it certainly isn't. It's just a different way of doing it, and actually has some terrible results as well.
And that's Martin Luther King's opinion as well. 52. David, in front of you we have.
In front of me, I'm looking at a tubular support bandage, the kind of thing you strap around your ankle, but also a small syringe that I now realise is the kind of syringe you use to give painkillers. And my second thing is one study of A&E departments in the USA suggests that black children are over 50% less likely to see stronger forms of pain than their white children.
Oh, yes, this comes from a very powerful book by Annabelle Soronimo on the fake racial science that underpins, ironically, many of the discoveries so-called in modern medicine, and how that's still incorporated in the category of new
shape of 24,576. Well, a book about maths, you can call that. The secret life of the German history of mathematics in its own sense, I think. So, Rebel, what did you enjoy about that book?
I enjoyed much more than I thought I would. As a non-mathematician and virtually illiterate myself, I found this was a very impressive book. It was impressive not only because
was largely useless.
Consider within the British Academy Book Prize, Global Cultural Understanding will be announced in mid-October. Find a list of all of those books on our free thinking program website and all of the information around that are available all around the world. Videos, podcast, and that, I think, is where we leave it for tonight. Thank you to all of my guests. Such a big conversation. Chad, Thompson, Timson, Stewart, Charles, and that's it. Start the week at Radio 4 on Monday with a conversation about touring, entertainment, featuring guests. We'll be back next Friday at 9 o'clock to hear some of the business taking part in how the right gets in the festival of ideas. Thanks for being with us.
Free Thinking was presented by Anne McElroy. The world tonight is coming up after a look at the weather. Tonight England and Wales will stay dry with mostly clear skies. Northern Ireland will turn dry but remain cloudy. Scotland will be cloudy and breezy with outbreaks of rain from the northwest. Eastern England will be chilly but it will be warm for all other areas. Tomorrow England and Wales will be dry with sun spells. Northern Ireland and Scotland will be cloudier with rain in the far northwest. Temperatures near the seasonal average. On Sunday, northern England will see rain at first, clearing into Wales and central England, then southern parts later. Scotland will have showers at first, becoming drier later. Northern Ireland will be dry and Monday. Most areas will be dry with the best of the sunshine in central and eastern parts. And listen to BBC Radio 4.
Hello and welcome to the World Tonight. I'm Sean Labour, at 9 to 10. In the past few minutes, the Prime Minister has sat down in the White House with President Biden as tensions grow with Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Back here, very good.
Chris Mason, our British President, joins me live from Washington. How important is responsibility to coordinate their decisions for the local wide open? To astronauts stranded on the International Space Station for the first time about how their people are being stuck there into next year.
My friends, you know what? There are so many people on Earth that are sending us messages, and everybody's cheering for us to get back.
But the routine of life in space, and as Prince Harry declares, he's excited about turning routines again. A discussion of whether our attitudes to the milestone of the birthday ended in a zero is changing.
I turned 40 on 4th of July this year. It feels like a real decade where you can be yourself, explore your creativity, be brilliantly in all kinds of ways, or not, just be exactly who you are.
This evening by Charles Carroll. Keir Starmer is holding talks with US President Joe Biden at the White House to discuss Ukraine's potential use of long-range missiles supplied by the West in military targets inside Russia. The meeting comes a day after President Putin warned his allies against allowing their use, saying that they would be directly involving themselves in the conflict. The White House has described President Putin's threat as incredibly dangerous. Our political editor, Chris Mason, is travelling with the Prime Minister on Saturday. At the heart of this trip, a big strategic call: allow Ukraine to fire Western missiles into Russia or not. He appeared towards the answer to that, meaning yes. A public definitive answer is not expected quite yet, though. Seeking Western coordination and agreement, and quickly, knowing that now some threats about what Moscow might do in retaliation, others urge the West to crack on. A conflict without obvious end presents two no end of thorny dilemmas, two outrageous burning things. What constitutes action, and what are the consequences of inaction? One office has rejected Russia's claim that 6 British diplomats had been spying on Moscow, describing the accusation as invasive. The Kremlin has stripped the officials involved of their accreditation. Left Russia weeks ago. Our diplomatic correspondent, Caroline Hall, has this report.
The announcement of Russia's move against the 6 British diplomats came early this morning on state-run TV, which showed photographs of them, along with the words "spy factory." The FSB, which replaced the Soviet era KGB, accreditation had been terminated in response to what it called numerous unfriendly steps taken by London. Shortly afterwards came a statement from the Foreign Office, which has asked us not to identify the diplomats, describing the accusations against them as completely baseless. Officials say they're now back in the UK after losing their accreditation in mid-August, which begs the question why Russia is making this public now. The timing with Sir Keir Starmer in Washington to discuss missiles from Ukraine seems designed to send a message.
Climate campaign groups are demanding plans for the UK's first deep coal mine in 30 years to be shelved for good. The High Court quashed them. A judge ruled that giving the go-ahead to proceed with Whitehaven had been legally flawed. After mining allegation of granting permission to sell the site to the Conservative government in 2022. He said it was nothing like the judgment. The Pope has sharply criticised the Democrat and Republican candidates in the US presidential election as being against life. Speaking on a flight back to Rome, his visit to Singapore, Pope Francis rebuked Kamala Harris over her pro-choice abortion stance and Donald Trump for his plans to deport millions of migrants. But he insisted Americans still had to vote and would have to choose what he called the lesser of two evils.
And they all both are against life, whether it's the one who's chasing away migrants or the one who's killing children. Both are against life. I can't decide. I can't say I'm not an American and I will not be voting for them. Expelling migrants, not giving them the possibility of working, not welcoming migrants is a sin. It is grave.
The only presenter of the BBC series For the Care Shop, Kate Race, has been charged with engaging in controlling and coercing behaviour of his wife. West Mercia Police said it launched an investigation into Mr. Davis in early May after his wife posted a message on social media saying their marriage had ended. The BBC said that it didn't comment on the role in the proceedings. A British man is among 37 people who have been sentenced to death by a military court in the Democratic Republic of Congo for taking part in what the authorities have called an attempted coup. Armed men quickly occupied the president's office in the capital Kinshasa in May. 6 people died in the unrest. The government has said that it will fund the redevelopment of the football stadium in Belfast in time for the Football European Championships in 2028. Without Eastwood Park, it's likely Northern Ireland will be the only UK nation not to host the matches during the tournament. Our Ireland correspondent, Chris Bush, has more.
Eastwood Park is the only venue in Northern Ireland due to host matches in Euro 2028. European Football Championships are being held in the UK and the Republic of Ireland. The stadium in West Belfast has been derelict for more than a decade. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Hugh Ben, and the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, informed all ministers of their decision in a letter. They said the estimated costs had risen dramatically from £180 million to potentially over £100 million. They also posed that there is a significant risk the stadium couldn't be built in time. Some unionist politicians had opposed the project. Eastwood Park is named after an Irish Republican revolutionary and is primarily a venue for Gaelic games, which are mainly played by people from the Irish nationalist community. The Northern Ireland football team's supporters tend to come from a unionist background.
A Scottish government minister has told the BBC that there's a possible buyer for the Grangemouth oil refinery. The plant's current owners, Petrolinos, announced yesterday that they were closing the site on the 3rd of March with 400 jobs being cut. The public finance minister, Ivan McKee, said that any deal would take time, but there was absolutely a potential buyer. And two NASA astronauts stuck on the International Space Station say they don't feel let down by Boeing, despite being stranded there by problems with the company's Starliner craft. It returned to Earth without Sue Williams and Butch Wilmore last week after developing technical problems. What was originally planned as an 8-day stay in space will now last for 8 months. Speaking from the ISS, Ms. Williams told a news conference they were keeping calm.
We're here with our friends. I think that's really a key part of being on the International Space Station and actually just doing the work. So that's, I think the up part is we're here with our friends.